your grandmother never measured a single thing. She cracked an egg into flour, watched how the dough moved under her hand, and knew exactly when it was right. That skill did not come from a cookbook. It came from generations of black women who turned poverty into genius, who stretched a single ham hock through a week of meals, and who built techniques so effective that entire industries tried to copy them and sell them back at 10 times the price. Some of these tricks were dismissed as backwards. Others were quietly banned from commercial kitchens because they made expensive equipment and store-bought shortcuts completely unnecessary. Today, food scientists are finally catching up, and what they are finding is that the chemistry behind these methods was sound all along. Number 25, cooking in a black cast iron skillet. A skillet handed down from a great aunt in Tuskegee, scraped clean with salt, never washed with soap. The black grandmother oiled the surface with a rag dipped in bacon grease, set it on the burner, and started supper. You would hear it pop the second the cornbread batter hit the heat. A 2020 review in the Journal of Hematology found that food cooked in cast iron picked up 2 to 5 extra milligrams of iron per serving, with acidic dishes like tomato gravy taking up the most. For black households where store-bought meat was rationed by the paycheck, that skillet quietly fed your bloodstream like a hidden vitamin. The pamphlets in the 1970s warned women to switch to non-stick. The same non-stick coatings were pulled off the market for chemical leaching 40 years later. The skillet outlived the warning. Her cornbread still came out with a crust the color of pecan shell. The science had caught up. Number 24 on this list was the root that gave old root beer and sassafras tea their bite until the FDA struck it from food in 1960. Number 16 dyed the candy and red velvet on every church table before federal regulators delisted it in 1976. Number 8 on this list was the sweetener that let our grandmothers cut sugar and still bake until Washington banned it in 1969. None of these were yanked to spite our cooking. They were pulled because new science raised real questions about safety, and the agencies acted. So before we begin, hit subscribe and open the cabinet, because here are 25 banned soul food ingredients the government once pulled from shelves. Number 25, lard fried chicken. A cast iron skillet on a wood stove in Greenville, Mississippi, holding 3 inches of pork fat the grandmother had rendered herself from a shoulder trim that morning. She strained it through cheesecloth into a tin she kept behind the stove, the same tin her own mother had used. The thighs went in skin down, sizzling so loud she could not hear the radio. She fried them slow, never rushed, until the skin shattered like glass when you bit into it. The kitchen smelled like sizzle and smoke and Sunday afternoon. On Sundays after church, the family ate it standing in the kitchen because there were not enough chairs and nobody minded. Then, in 1977, a Senate report told her to stop. Lard was the new enemy. Switch to soybean oil, cottonseed oil. Anything but the fat that had fed her people through 2 world wars. She didn't switch. By the time researchers in 2010 admitted lard had no real link to heart disease, she had been gone 12 years. Her recipe was already in her granddaughter's hand. Number 25, salt box pork curing. Before refrigeration reached black homes in the rural South, salt was the only thing standing between your family and hunger. A hog was slaughtered in November when the air turned cold. Every cut was rubbed thick with coarse salt and stacked in a wooden box, layer after layer, like bricks in a wall, with salt packed between each piece. The meat sat for weeks, drawing moisture out through osmosis until bacteria could not survive on its surface. That box was the family's bank account in meat. The USDA later said this method was unreliable because home cooks could not measure salinity precisely enough. But food scientists at Texas A&M have confirmed that salt concentrations above 6% create conditions where salmonella and E. coli cannot reproduce. Your great-grandmother did not own a salinity meter. She used her hands and her mother's memory. The pork lasted through March. That was enough. Number 20, before anything touched the stove, your mother stood at the sink with half a lemon and a bottle of white vinegar, scrubbing every piece of chicken like she was baptizing it. In black kitchens across the 1960s, washing meat was the first commandment rooted in West African food traditions that crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade. Enslaved cooks received the least desirable cuts, parts that arrived with odors demanding cleaning before seasoning could begin. Generations later, the ritual held. The lemon cut through slime and the vinegar neutralized bacteria before anyone had a name for it. Your mother rubbed every joint, every cavity, every fold of skin, and if you tried to skip this step, she stopped you cold. It was never just about germs. It was about respect, preparing food with the same care you gave the people eating it. If your kitchen did not smell like vinegar before it smelled like seasoning, you were not from the right kitchen. Before anyone called it a crime, there was a kitchen in Harlem where a woman boiled pig feet in a pot so big it took up half the stove. Pig feet were the centerpiece of rent parties, illegal apartment gatherings where tenants charged a quarter at the door and served plates alongside bootleg gin just to make rent. Langston Hughes saved hand-printed party tickets in a red box. The feet simmered for hours in vinegar, onion, garlic, and crushed red pepper until the cartilage turned to silk. They were served on wax paper with hot sauce, eaten standing up because the furniture was pushed against the walls for dancing. The Volstead Act made the gin illegal. Jim Crow made the gathering dangerous, but every Saturday night, those kitchens opened anyway, and the smell drifted through hallways where a fat Waller played piano for a plate and $1. Nobody throws those parties anymore. That cast iron skillet never left the stovetop. She fried eggs in it at dawn, seared pork chops at noon, and baked cornbread in it come evening. The same pan, same seasoning built up over decades. Doctors warned families to throw out the heavy iron and switch to non-stick coated in chemicals. They said the old skillets were unsanitary. What they never mentioned was that cast iron leaches bioavailable iron directly into food, 2 to 5 milligrams per serving when cooking acidic dishes like tomato gravy. A trial in Ethiopia found kids fed from iron pots saw hemoglobin jump nearly 2 grams per deciliter in 12 months. Meanwhile, the non-stick replacements were flaking Teflon into every meal. She seasoned that skillet with lard, wiped it with a rag, and hung it on the nail. The one she left behind still cooks better than anything on the shelf. Health officials in the 1960s declared animal fats the enemy, pushing hydrogenated vegetable oils as safer alternatives, the same trans fats now banned by the FDA for causing heart disease. Lard contains 60% monounsaturated fat, the same heart-healthy fat found in olive oil, and has less saturated fat than butter. She rendered it herself after hog killing day, straining hot pork fat through cheesecloth into those old Folgers cans that stayed by the burner until the metal wore thin. You knew her kitchen by the can. You knew her biscuits by the way they shattered when you broke them open. The 2025 dietary guidelines quietly listed animal fats among acceptable cooking fats. She did not need a reversal, she needed the can, and the can never lied. She poured it warm from the pail, and it tasted nothing like what comes in a plastic jug today. Cooking with lard and animal fats was the backbone of every African-American kitchen before health officials declared war on it in the mid-20th century. Families rendered their own lard from hog fat, storing it in tin cans and using it for biscuits, fried chicken, and pie crusts. The fat gave food a richness that vegetable shortening could never match. When government guidelines pushed margarine and hydrogenated oils as healthier, traditional fats were labeled dangerous. But recent studies reversed that verdict, showing natural lard contains less saturated fat than butter and none of the trans fats in processed substitutes. Scientists now recognize that animal fats Black grandmothers relied on were more stable for frying and carried fat-soluble vitamins. What was dismissed as backward turned out to be nutritionally sound. Double dipping in seasoned flour was a technique African American cooks mastered generations before culinary schools taught coating methods. The process involved dredging meat in seasoned flour, dipping it into buttermilk, and coating it again before frying. This created multiple layers, sealing in moisture while building shatteringly crisp exterior. Scientists confirmed the double layer creates a barrier slowing moisture loss, keeping interior tender while the outside achieves maximum crunch. Grandmothers knew this instinctively, passing the method down without laboratory validation. The technique was popular for fried chicken and catfish, where extra coating absorbed seasonings and developed deeper flavor. Modern chefs rediscovered what Black kitchens never forgot: patience produces results no shortcut can match. Soaking beans with baking soda overnight was a technique passed down through generations of African American cooks who understood something science would take decades to prove. Grandmothers added just a pinch of baking soda to soaking water, letting dried beans sit until they softened and swelled. The alkaline environment broke down complex sugars in bean skins that caused digestive discomfort while reducing cooking time significantly. Modern food scientists confirmed that elevated pH weakens pectin in cell walls, allowing water to penetrate faster and heat to distribute evenly. This simple addition transformed tough dried beans into silky digestible protein that fed entire families affordably. What was once dismissed as old wives' tale is now recognized as practical chemistry. Using newspaper to clean windows was a technique perfected in African American households long before commercial glass cleaners existed. Grandmothers would crumple sheets of black and white newsprint, dampen them with vinegar water, and rub glass surfaces until they sparkled without streaks. The secret lay in the newspaper's dense fiber structure and petroleum-based ink, which acted as a mild abrasive and polish simultaneously. Scientists have since confirmed that carbon in printer's ink creates a film that repels dust and water. This hack costs nothing, since newspapers were typically free or already in the home. Children learned this technique watching mothers transform smudged windows into crystal clear panes with nothing but yesterday's headlines. Cooking collard greens for hours was dismissed as overcooking vegetables into mush, yet African American grandmothers knew something nutritionists took decades to confirm. The long, slow simmer breaks down tough cellulose fibers that human stomachs struggle to digest, releasing nutrients that quick-cooked greens keep locked away. Scientists now understand that extended cooking times make minerals like calcium and iron far more bioavailable. Families gathered around pots that simmered all Sunday morning, filling kitchens with that unmistakable aroma of greens seasoned with smoked meat. What seemed like patience born of tradition was actually sophisticated food science, practiced without laboratories. Those hours at the stove created meals that nourished in ways fast cooking never could. Number 23, slow simmering greens to draw the pot liquor. A heavy aluminum pot on a back burner in Greenville, Mississippi, with 3 bunches of collard greens, a smoked ham hock, and 4 cups of water. She let it ride at a low rumble for an hour and a half. She never lifted the lid. The dark green broth at the bottom of the pot was the part she saved. That broth was pot liquor. Vitamins A, C, and K leached out of the leaves into the water like dye out of cloth. The iron from the smoked bone joined them. Your body absorbed it cup by cup. A 2019 review in Nutrients confirmed the liquid held more bioavailable iron and folate than the greens. Her grandmother told her the same thing in 1942. Number 25, Tonka bean. Long before vanilla got cheap, cooks reached for Tonka bean and the coumarin inside it to flavor custards, puddings, and the imitation vanilla that sweetened many a Sunday cake. It carried a warm scent, somewhere between vanilla and almond and fresh-cut hay, and a few drops went a long way in a poor kitchen. It turned up in cheap flavoring extracts sold right off the grocery shelf, a way for our grandmothers to stretch a little sweetness across a big family. Then the science turned. Researchers tied coumarin to liver damage in animals, and in 1954, the Food and Drug Administration banned it outright as a food additive. The extracts vanished, and the small brown bottles that once sat beside the sugar were quietly pulled from the shelves. Most cooks never knew the name of the thing they had been stirring in. Tonka bean was one of the first flavors Washington decided our kitchens could no longer keep. Number 23, hog jowl with greens. The cured cheek of the pig went into a heavy iron pot at first light, covered with water, and did not come off the stove until afternoon. A cook in rural Virginia layered collard leaves on top, stem side down, and watched the fat slowly melt through the green. The pot smoked low for hours. The kitchen smelled of pork and earth and wood smoke. Edna Lewis, born in Freetown, Virginia, in 1916, wrote about this dish in 1976 the way other people write about prayer. She kept cooking it until she passed in 2006. Her recipe outlived the entire low-fat decade. Doctors warned against jowl meat through every one of those years. What the warnings missed is that the fat was not contaminating the leaf. The fat was the reason your body could pull the iron out of the leaf at all. Your great-grandmother in 1958 knew this without a single chart. She just watched her grandchildren grow. Number 22, smoke curing with green hickory. In the smokehouse behind nearly every black homestead in the rural South, hams and shoulders hung from rafters above a smoldering pit of green hickory wood. The smoke was not just for flavor, it was chemistry in the air, invisible and exact. The phenols in wood smoke acted as antioxidants that slowed fat breakdown. The formaldehyde and acetic acid lowered the pH on the surface of the meat, creating an antimicrobial barrier that worked around the clock. A properly smoked ham lasted an entire year hanging in that smokehouse. The USDA declared backyard smokehouses unsanitary in the mid-20th century because temperatures could not be precisely controlled. But the compounds in hickory smoke do the same work whether you monitor them with a thermometer or not. Your grandfather knew the smoke was ready when it smelled right. He read that smokehouse the way a doctor reads a chart. He could not name a single phenol. He did not need to. Skillet was older than your mother. It came from her mother, who got it from hers, and each woman added another layer of seasoning no store could sell. In the 1960s, black families treated cast iron like heirlooms, rubbing them with pork fat after every use, never touching them with soap. The fat polymerized into a slick dark coating, better than any nonstick surface invented since. Your grandmother heated the skillet slowly, wiped it with lard using a folded cloth, and let it cool in the oven until the metal absorbed everything. That coating held decades of Sunday dinners, fish fries, and Wednesday night cornbread. The iron leached into food, giving families extra dietary iron during years when nutrition was a luxury. Scientists confirmed that cooking acidic foods in cast iron increases the iron content of a meal. But what science cannot measure is how the skillet carried flavor forward, how your mother's cornbread tasted like her mother's because the pan remembered. They will tell you prohibition only banned drinking. They will not tell you it banned cooking. The Volstead Act turned grandmothers into criminals overnight. Peach brandy and cobbler was never about getting drunk. A tablespoon folded into the peaches with brown sugar and cinnamon before the batter went on top. It deepened the fruit, burned off mostly in the oven, and left a warmth that sugar alone could never give. Households hid brandy in medicine bottles, traded with neighbors who had working stills. Federal agents raided black homes at far higher rates than white ones. Historian Lisa McGurr documented the disproportionate enforcement of prohibition on African American communities, so the women baked quieter. When the last of the brandy ran dry, the cobbler still tasted good, but something underneath was gone. A depth, a heat, the ghost of a recipe nobody dared write down. The pot sat on the back of the stove from before church until well after the last plate was scraped clean. Nobody rushed it. It just simmered, low, steady, all day, while the kitchen filled with the smell so thick you could taste it before you lifted the lid. Modern cooking culture called this inefficient. Quick cook methods promise the same result in minutes, but collagen in bone-in meats converts to gelatin at around 160 degrees, and that transformation depends on both temperature and duration. The longer the simmer, the richer the yield of glycine, proline, and dissolved minerals drawn from cartilage and marrow. Those Sunday pots of stewed meat, neck bones settling into gravy, beans thickening against smoked pork, they were extracting nutrients no 30-minute shortcut can replicate. She knew the pot was ready by the way the house smelled. That was chemistry she learned standing next to her own mother, watching the lid rattle just enough to know the heat was right. Before the Crisco campaigns of the early 1900s convinced America that vegetable shortening was cleaner and more modern than animal fat, whole raw milk was a staple in rural black households through the 1950s, drawn from family cows or shared between neighbors who kept dairy goats across the Deep South. The FDA banned the interstate sale of raw milk in 1987, calling it dangerous, but studies published in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology found that children raised on raw milk had significantly lower rates of asthma and allergies. The milk contained natural lactase-producing bacteria that aided digestion. The same grandmothers labeled lactose intolerant by doctors had been drinking milk just fine for years. She skimmed the cream for butter, let the rest clabber for baking, and wasted nothing. When the cow was gone, the milk changed, and so did the mornings. It came in tins so heavy a child needed both hands to carry one, and it sat on the shelf like medicine because that is exactly what it was. Every black kitchen in the South kept lard within arm's reach. It went into biscuits, greased the cornbread pan, seasoned the greens, and fried the fish on Friday. When public health campaigns hit full speed in the 1960s, they painted lard as poison, the cause of heart disease and early death. What they never said was that lard is roughly 45% monounsaturated. Fat, the same heart-friendly fat in olive oil. It has less saturated fat than butter and none of the trans fats that riddled hydrogenated vegetable shortenings. It carries fat-soluble vitamins D and E and holds up under deep frying heat without breaking down into harmful compounds. Every biscuit she pulled from that oven, golden and flaky from rendered pork fat, was better for you than anything made with the processed alternatives that replaced it. For families across the rural South from the 1930s through the 70s, fatback was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Every pot of greens, every skillet of cornbread, every pot of beans started with a piece dropped in to render. The American Heart Association spent decades warning against saturated fats, and fatback sat at the top of their list. But it is also rich in vitamin D and oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat praised in avocados. Salt cured and stored in a cool cellar, it lasted months without refrigeration, essential where electricity was unreliable and grocery stores were miles of dirt road away. She sliced it, thin for seasoning, thick for frying, and never let the supply drop below what February required. The hands that unwrapped that butcher paper fed everyone who walked through the door, and when those hands stopped reaching for the freezer, the greens never tasted right again. Poke salad greens were a springtime tradition in African American households across the rural South, gathered wild from fields when fresh vegetables were scarce. Health officials warned against eating pokeweed for decades, calling it toxic. And they were partly right. Raw pokeweed contains compounds that cause illness. But Black families already knew that, which is why the greens were always boiled in multiple changes of water before being sauteed with onions and fatback. This process removed the harmful toxins while preserving impressive nutrition. Scientists now confirm that properly prepared poke salad is rich in vitamins A and C, iron, and antioxidants that rival cultivated greens. The knowledge of safe preparation was passed through generations of women who understood botany through practice. Resting meat at room temperature before frying was considered dangerous by modern standards, yet African American cooks practiced it for generations with remarkable results. Pulling chicken from the refrigerator 30 minutes before frying allowed protein to temper, ensuring even cooking throughout. Cold meat dropped into hot oil causes temperature shock, leading to uneven cooking where outside burns while inside stays underdone. Scientists acknowledge brief room temperature resting produces superior texture and doneness. The technique also prevented excessive oil splatter since warmer meat released less moisture violently upon contact with hot fat. Grandmothers understood rushing the process never yielded best results, and their patience created fried foods with perfect interiors. Rice with a clean dish towel under the lid was a technique African American cooks used to achieve perfectly fluffy grains every single time. After bringing rice to a boil and reducing to simmer, grandmothers draped a thin cotton towel over the pot before replacing the lid. The towel absorbed excess moisture that would otherwise drip back onto rice, creating soggy, clumpy results. This simple barrier allowed steam to work while wicking away condensation that ruined texture. Food scientists studying rice preparation now recommend this exact method, explaining that the towel prevents water from pooling while maintaining humid environment needed for even cooking. What seemed like grandmother's quirky habit was actually precise moisture control that professional chefs now teach. Using vinegar rinses to make hair shine was an African American beauty secret that hairdressers now scientifically support and recommend. Grandmothers would mix apple cider vinegar with water for final rinses after washing, producing remarkable shine and manageability that lasted for days. Scientists have confirmed that vinegar's acidity closes the hair cuticle, smoothing scales that cause dullness while removing soap residue. This technique was especially valuable for natural hair textures enhancing curl definition and reducing tangles without expensive products. Women would share their exact ratios at beauty parlors, perfecting formulas through generations of careful experimentation. The practice cost pennies compared to commercial products. Using bacon grease as cooking fat was condemned for decades as unhealthy habit that would clog arteries. Yet African American cooks never stopped saving every precious drop. Modern research reveals that rendered pork fat contains less saturated fat than butter and provides stable cooking temperatures that prevent harmful compounds created when vegetable oils break down. Scientists discovered that animal fats contain fat-soluble vitamins processed oils lack entirely. Grandmothers kept ceramic crocks by the stove, straining bacon, drippings for seasoning vegetables and frying eggs. What nutritionists once banned as dangerous, researchers now acknowledge as traditional wisdom that understood fat quality matters more than fat avoidance. That humble grease jar held more intelligence than years of misguided dietary advice. Number 24, rendering pork fat at home for cooking lard. A cut of fatback, the butcher in Selma, sold for 9 cents a pound in 1958, set in a heavy pot on a low flame for 2 hours. The grease ran off clear and pale, the cracklings dark and salt bright. She poured the lard into a quart jar and labeled the date in pencil on the lid. That was your supper for the week. By 1977, a Senate report told her to stop using it. By 2010, the Siri Torino meta-analysis followed 347,000 people across 21 studies and reported no clear link between saturated fat and heart disease. Lard sits at roughly 45% mono-1-saturated fat, the same family as olive oil. She hadn't waited for the journal. She'd been frying her chicken in pure pork fat the entire time. Her oil never went rancid in the cabinet. Number 23, sea turtle meat. Along the Gullah Geechee coast of the Carolinas and Georgia, turtle was once a Sunday food, stewed slow with onions, sherry, and dark roux into a soup that fed whole families. Green sea turtle was the prize, rich and almost beefy, and the recipes for it passed down through low country kitchens for generations. Coastal black communities had cooked it since slavery, turning a creature that washed up in the marsh into something worth gathering around. But the great sea turtles were vanishing, hunted toward the edge of extinction up and down both coasts. So Congress acted. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 made it illegal to take, sell, or serve any of the 6 sea turtle species in American waters, and turtle soup left the menu. Restaurants that had served it for 100 years quietly dropped it. A dish older than the recipes that named it was ended not by taste but by law. Number 24, crackling cornbread. The skillet came out of the oven roaring, the crust cracked open over a layer of crisp pork bits that had been pressed into stone-ground cornmeal an hour before. A cook in Tuscaloosa would save the cracklings from rendering lard, never throw them out, and fold them cold into the batter so they kept their crunch through the bake. The bread sat on the table beside greens and a pot of beans. Children grabbed it before the grown folks sat down. For decades, 1990s, dietitians counted only the fat grams and called the bread dangerous. They did not count the corn. They did not count the pork skin, which is roughly 30% collagen. They did not count the way a child finished a plate when there was a slab of crackling bread on it. Today, the same cracklings sit on the shelves of your local health food store for $14 a bag. The Skillet always knew. The chart took 30 years to catch up. 4, pot liquor preservation. When your grandmother boiled collard greens with a ham hock for 3 hours, the liquid left behind was not waste. It was medicine in a mason jar. She saved that greenish broth, rich as liquid gold, poured it into jars, and kept it on the back porch in winter or the root cellar in summer. Families drank it straight or sopped it with cornbread. Extension agents told black families to throw the cooking water away because boiling destroyed the vitamins. They were half right and completely wrong. Researchers in Spain found that boiling extracted 50% of total flavonoids and 60% of vitamin C into the cooking liquid. The vitamins were not destroyed. They migrated into the pot liquor like passengers changing trains. The women who saved that broth were capturing every nutrient the greens had to give. They did not need a study to know it kept their children strong through winter. Black mothers in the 1960s cooked by the look of the batter, the weight of flour in a cupped palm, the color of the roux as it darkened. A pinch meant something specific to her fingers. A splash of vanilla was always the same splash. She knew biscuit dough was right by how it pulled from her hands, and she knew rice had enough water by pressing her fingertip to the surface. This was mastery passed from mother to daughter through thousands of repetitions, a cooking language built on touch rather than numbers. The knowledge came from West African kitchens where written recipes never existed, carried through plantation houses where enslaved women fed dozens without a single instruction card. You learned by standing next to her, watching her hands, and when she died, no cookbook could teach you what she knew. In 1907, Alabama appointed its first game commissioner, and his opening argument was that black men who hunted did not work hard enough on tenant farms. That was the real reason behind the hunting laws, not conservation, but control. Possum roast suppers had been tradition in black households since before emancipation, rooted in West African practices of using every protein the land offered. The possum was soaked overnight in salted water, then slow roasted with sweet potatoes until the fat rendered down and the meat fell apart. People gathered on autumn nights, the smell drifting across cotton fields. But the new laws required licenses that cost money sharecroppers did not have, and wardens arrested black men caught hunting after dark. The suppers grew quieter, the hunts moved deeper into woods where no warden walked, and as folks migrated north to cities with no possums, no pits, no autumn nights smelling like roasting fat, the tradition slipped away, not because anyone chose to leave it, but because the law made keeping it too costly. If the fat she cooked with was the quiet medicine, the liquid left in the bottom of the greens pot was the loud one, dark as swamp water, smoky from the ham hock, sharp with vinegar. They called it pot liquor, and grandmothers poured it into cups, sopped it with cornbread, or saved it for tomorrow's soup. Doctors said boiled vegetables lost their nutrition, and the liquid was just salty water. Researchers proved the opposite. Boiling extracts over 50% of flavonoids and 60% of vitamin C directly into the cooking water. That pot liquor was loaded with vitamins A, C, and K, plus iron and calcium pulled from the collards during hours of slow simmering. The fat from the ham hock made carotenoids more absorbable since they are fat soluble. She was not wasting nutrition, she was concentrating it. The women who drank that broth were dosing themselves with exactly what their bodies needed. Chitlins, slow boiled with vinegar, were long considered one of the most controversial dishes in African American cuisine, ridiculed by outsiders and warned against by food safety officials. The dish required hours of meticulous cleaning and boiling, a process many authorities dismissed as risky. But families understood something science recently confirmed. Slow boiling with vinegar created an acidic environment that destroyed harmful bacteria while tenderizing the meat into something rich and flavorful. The vinegar acted as both a natural disinfectant and flavor enhancer, cutting through the heaviness of the pork. Modern food scientists now acknowledge this method of acidic slow cooking was effective food safety long before refrigeration existed. The women who stood over those pots were practicing microbiology without the title. Using lard instead of vegetable oil was standard in African American kitchens until industrial marketing convinced generations that processed oils were healthier. Pure rendered pork fat created fried foods with unmatched flavor and impossibly crisp textures vegetable oils cannot replicate. Lard has a higher smoke point than many vegetable oils, remaining stable at frying temperatures without breaking down into harmful compounds. Scientists revisited the demonization of animal fats, finding lard contains less saturated fat than butter and no artificial trans fats. African American grandmothers rendered their own lard from pork fat, ensuring purity commercial products cannot match. What was dismissed as backward cooking has been vindicated by nutritional science, proving traditional wisdom was ahead of its time. Saving bacon, grease in a coffee can by the stove was a ritual in African American kitchens that outsiders sometimes viewed as unsanitary or old-fashioned. Every morning after frying bacon, grandmothers carefully strained rendered fat through cheesecloth into a dedicated container, building up a supply of cooking gold. This grease became the foundation for cornbread, fried eggs, and seasoned vegetables, adding depth no store-bought oil could match. Food scientists now recognize that properly strained bacon grease, kept at room temperature, remains safe for weeks because rendering removes moisture where bacteria thrive. The fat also contains oleic acid, the same heart-healthy compound in olive oil. What critics called primitive was actually brilliant preservation. Placing brown paper bags under fresh baked bread to cool was wisdom passed down through generations of African American bakers. The paper absorbed excess moisture while allowing just enough steam to escape, preventing soggy crust while keeping the interior tender. Modern food scientists now understand this creates perfect humidity balance, maintaining bread quality far better than cooling racks. Grandmothers knew instinctively what laboratories took decades to confirm. The brown paper's porous structure wicked away condensation without removing essential moisture from the crumb. Women saved their grocery bags specifically for this purpose, washing and reusing them until worn thin. Church bake sales featured loaves, cooled this way, their crusts perfectly crisp. Drinking pot liquor from greens was a practice that made outsiders cringe. Yet African American families treasured every drop of that dark, rich cooking liquid. Modern nutrition research confirms what grandmothers always knew, that broth contains concentrated vitamins and minerals that leach from the greens during cooking. Scientists discovered pot liquor holds more nutritional value than the vegetables themselves, packed with water-soluble vitamins B and C. Families would sip it warm from cups or soak cornbread until it softened into a nourishing meal. During lean times, this liquid gold stretched resources while delivering essential nutrition. What doctors now call nutrient-dense broth, Black families simply called pot liquor, and they never wasted a single precious drop. Number 22, stewing meat with bone end cuts for hours. Neck bones, oxtail, smoked turkey wings, ham hocks. Cuts the white grocer in Tuscaloosa would hand over for almost nothing because the cookbooks of the time called them inedible. She set them in a pot with onion, celery, and water and let them go for 3 hours on a back burner. The collagen in the bones broke down into gelatin like wax over heat. The marrow released glycine and proline into the broth, 2 amino acids that build connective tissue and line your gut wall. In 2016, doctors began prescribing bone broth for leaky gut and surgery recovery. They called it a discovery. The cuts the pamphlets told her to skip were now sold in glass jars for $9 at your local market. She'd known the bone was the meal. 24 sassafras root. This was the root that gave old homemade root beer its deep, woody bite, and it brewed the sassafras tea that simmered on stoves across the rural South every spring. Folks dug it from the woods, boiled the bark, and drank it as a tonic to thin the blood after a long winter. The smell of it filled kitchens from Appalachia down to the Gulf. Then researchers isolated saffron, the oil that gave sassafras its flavor, and fed it to lab animals. It caused liver cancer in the rats, and the agency moved fast. In 1960, the FDA banned saffron as a food additive, which pulled real sassafras out of root beer and bottled drinks for good. The tea hung on in country kitchens a while longer, traded hand to hand, but the commercial route was finished. A flavor that once meant springtime and homemade soda was struck from the food supply by federal order. Number 22, salt pork seasoning meat. A working mother in Birmingham in 1934 walked into the corner store with 35 cents, walked out with a piece of cured pork the size of a deck of cards, and fed 7 people from it that night. She dropped it into a pot of pinto beans before sunrise and let the cure work its way through the broth all morning. By supper time, the beans tasted like they had been seasoned by a chef. Vertimai Smart Grosvenor, the Gula cook and writer, called this kind of seasoning meat the thing that taught beans how to taste. She wrote about it in 1970, defending the practice against the 1977 Senate committee that singled out cured pork as a target. The committee ate at hotels. The mother in Birmingham ate at her own kitchen table. She fed her 7 people protein and fiber and fat in a balance a 2025 sports dietitian would still recommend. She didn't call it a balance. She called it making it to Friday. Number 23, lard sealing. After rendering hog fat over a low fire until it turned white and clean, your grandmother poured that liquid lard over cooked meats in a crock until the fat covered every surface by at least an inch. When the lard cooled and solidified, it created an airtight seal like a wax lid that no bacteria could penetrate. The meat stayed preserved for months in a root cellar without any refrigeration at all. Families in the Delta kept crocks of lard-sealed pork in their cellars all winter. Health officials in the 1950s called this method dangerous and unsanitary. Modern food science tells a different story. Rendered lard, stored in a cool environment, creates an anaerobic barrier that prevents oxidation and microbial growth. French chefs call this technique confit and charge you $40 a plate. Black women in Mississippi called it putting up meat and charged nothing. Today's gourmet is yesterday's survival. Every black kitchen in the 1960s had a jar near the stove, murky and golden, filled with rendered bacon fat that never got thrown away. Your mother poured fresh drippings through a strainer and let them settle like she was making a deposit at the bank. That grease seasoned everything. Cornbread got a spoonful before the batter hit the skillet. Green beans simmered in it for hours. Eggs fried in it came out with edges so crisp they shattered at the touch of a fork. During the Second World War, the government collected bacon grease from households because the glycerin could be extracted for explosives, and black families who had been saving drippings for generations just shook their heads. A single jar replaced butter, oil, and half the seasonings in the cabinet, turning the cheapest ingredients into meals that tasted rich. Today, chefs charge extra for dishes finished in animal fat. Your mother never charged a cent. She never owned a measuring cup, not because she could not afford one, but because she did not need one. You could always tell which smokehouse had a corn liquor ham inside because the air smelled different, sweeter, sharper, like wood smoke, and something forbidden underneath. Corn liquor cured ham was the oldest preservation secret in the rural Black South, passed between households that understood moonshine was not just for drinking. The ham was rubbed with salt, brown sugar, and red pepper, then mopped with corn liquor before hanging in the smokehouse for weeks. The alcohol drew moisture out while the sugar and smoke sealed the outside, a flavor no store-bought cure could match. When Prohibition made distilling a federal crime, every smokehouse became evidence. Agents and sheriffs, sometimes working alongside Klan-affiliated enforcement leagues, targeted black farms first. The hams vanished from their hooks. The stills went deeper into the hollows, and a preservation method older than the country that banned it slowly went silent. Went on the counter before bed. Dried pintos covered in cold water, left to sit through the night, swelling slowly in the dark. By morning, the beans had doubled, and the water had turned cloudy with everything the soak pulled out. Quick soak methods and canned beans promised the same result without the wait. But that overnight soak was breaking down phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that binds to iron, zinc, and calcium and blocks the body from absorbing them. Studies show that soaking legumes 12 hours reduces phytic acid up to 70%, dramatically improving mineral absorption. The soak also breaks down oligosaccharides, complex sugars responsible for gas and bloating. She did not call it anti-nutrient reduction. She called it putting the beans on. And she poured off that cloudy water in the morning without a second thought because her mother had done it and her mother before that, and nobody ever asked why. Blackstrap molasses, the thick, dark, almost bitter final extraction of sugarcane processing, was stockpiled by the gallon in black kitchens from the 1930s through the 70s. A single tablespoon holds 3.5 milligrams of iron, nearly 20% of the daily requirement, plus calcium, magnesium, and potassium. Doctors never recommended it. The sugar industry labeled it waste. But she stirred it into warm water every morning for tired blood, spooned it over biscuits, and baked it into gingerbread, so dense you could taste the cane fields. The Old Ways African Heritage diet now lists blackstrap molasses as a culturally significant source of plant-based iron. She bought it cheap when refined sugar cost more than her grocery budget allowed, and what the world called a byproduct, she called survival. If you opened her freezer, fatback was the first thing you saw. Thick slabs wrapped tight in butcher paper, stacked like currency. Sassafras, tea, and filet powder were staples in African American kitchens, especially in Creole communities where ground sassafras leaves thickened gumbo and brewed root bark made a fragrant tea. In the 1960s, the FDA banned sassafras oil after studies linked saffron to liver damage in rats. The ban criminalized a tradition that had nourished families for centuries, but modern researchers revisited those findings and noted the doses given to rats were astronomically higher than normal cooking use. The sassafras leaves in filet powder contain almost no saffron, and homemade tea was far too diluted to pose real risk. Scientists now recognize sassafras also contains anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial compounds supporting immune health. What was banned turned out to be beneficial. Salting meat hours before frying was a practice modern cooks abandoned in favor of last-minute seasoning. Yet, African American kitchens maintained this tradition with delicious results. The technique involved generously salting chicken or fish and allowing it to rest for several hours or overnight before cooking. Salt draws moisture to the surface initially, but over time dissolves and is reabsorbed, carrying flavor deep into meat while restructuring proteins for better texture. Scientists call this dry brining, and research confirms it produces juicier, more flavorful results than immediate cooking. The method seasons meat throughout rather than just on surface, eliminating bland bites. Grandmothers knew good fried chicken required overnight preparation, and patience produced legendary results. Adding vinegar to greens while cooking was standard practice in African American kitchens long before nutritionists understood why it worked so well. A splash of apple cider or white vinegar went into the pot alongside collards, turnip greens, or mustard greens as they simmered with smoked meat. The acid broke down tough fibers, making leaves tender faster while preserving vibrant color. More importantly, vinegar increased the bioavailability of iron and minerals locked inside the greens, allowing bodies to absorb more nutrition. Modern research confirms acidic environments help convert non-HME iron into forms the body can use. This simple hack turned affordable leafy vegetables into nutritional powerhouses that sustained families through hard times. Rubbing butter on minor burns was dismissed by modern medicine before researchers discovered the science behind this African American remedy. Grandmothers would immediately apply cold butter to small kitchen burns, providing instant cooling relief and creating a protective barrier against infection. While doctors initially criticized this practice, studies have since shown that fat content creates an occlusive layer that locks in moisture and protects damaged skin from bacteria. The cold temperature also provided immediate pain relief by numbing nerve endings at the burn site. This hack was passed from mother to daughter in kitchens where cast iron skillets and wood stoves made burns a common occurrence. Women kept dedicated butter dishes near stoves specifically for this purpose. Cooking with cast iron skillets was standard practice in African American kitchens long before scientists discovered the pans actually fortified food with dietary iron. Research confirms that acidic foods like tomatoes and greens cooked in cast iron absorb significant amounts of the mineral, helping prevent anemia in communities with limited access to red meat. Those heavy black pans passed down through generations were doing double duty as cookware and nutritional supplements. Grandmothers seasoned their skillets with lard, building layers of natural non-stick coating that modern chemists struggle to replicate safely. What seemed like stubborn attachment to old equipment was actually health intervention disguised as tradition. Scientists now recommend cast iron cooking for the same benefits Black cooks enjoyed for centuries. Number 21, soaking dried beans overnight in cold water. A brown paper sack of dried navy beans bought from the corner store in Mobile for 11 cents a pound in 1956. She rinsed them in a colander, pulled out the stones, and covered them in a stoneware bowl with 3 inches of water before she went to bed. That was the whole step. By morning, the beans had doubled in size, and the soaking water had turned cloudy with phytic acid and oligosaccharides. She poured that water down the sink and started fresh. A 2018 study in the Journal of Food Science showed soaking cut phytic acid by half. That made iron, zinc, and calcium bioavailable. Pressure cookers from the convenience food era told her she could skip the soak. The skip was the part that gave you stomach trouble. She didn't skip. Number 21, comfrey. In old Southern home medicine, this broad-leafed plant was a fixture, brewed into a bitter tea for coughs and stomach trouble, and laid as a poultice on sprains and broken skin. Country healers and grandmothers kept it growing by the back door, and its leaves sometimes found their way into the greens pot the way any wild green might. People trusted it because their mothers had trusted it. But comfrey carries pyrrolizidine alkaloids, compounds that quietly scar the liver and have been tied to cancer in study after study. The damage builds slow, with no warning until it is far along. On July 6, 2001, the FDA acted to pull comfrey from every dietary supplement sold in the country, ending its long run as a kitchen cure. A remedy that had been handed down as wisdom for generations turned out to be poisoning the very organ it was meant to heal. Number 21, bacon grease biscuits. A small tin sat on the back shelf above every southern stove, half full of cold-saved bacon fat from breakfast. A cook in Mobile would scoop a teaspoon out with a butter knife, cut it into self-rising flour with a fork, and roll the dough out on the counter dusted with cornmeal. The biscuits went into a hot oven at 425 and came out 15 minutes later with tops cracked open. The fat carried vitamin A and vitamin D and vitamin K straight into a bite of bread. The 1990s fat-free era pushed margarine onto every supermarket shelf instead. By 2015, the FDA pulled those same hydrogenated oils off the shelves because the trans fats were killing people. The bacon grease tin, meanwhile, sat undisturbed on the same shelf for 40 years. Her biscuits kept rising. The food authorities, who told her to throw the tin out, had to come back and admit the replacement was worse than the thing they replaced. Number 21, vinegar pepper sauce. Every kitchen table in the Black South had a bottle of vinegar with hot peppers floating inside. It was not a condiment, it was a preservation system disguised as a table sauce. The peppers released capsaicin into the vinegar over time, creating a solution with both antimicrobial and antioxidant properties. You shook it over greens, beans, rice, or anything that needed brightening. When the vinegar ran low, you poured more in. The same peppers lasted for months, sometimes years. Some families passed the same bottle down through an entire growing season, refilling it the way you top off a gas tank. Food safety officials warned against storing peppers in vinegar at room temperature because the pH might not be low enough to prevent botulism. But vinegar sits at a pH between 2.4 and 3.4, well below the 4.6 threshold where Clostridium botulinum can grow. The science was on your grandmother's side the entire time. She just never got the credit. If the skillet held memory, the cornbread held identity, and the question of sugar told you exactly where a family stood. Black mothers added a pinch of sugar to their cornbread batter, and this single act separated them from white Southern cooks who insisted real cornbread was never sweet. Bob Jeffries wrote in his Soul Food cookbook that the line between soul food and Southern food came down to choices like this. The sugar was not much, maybe a tablespoon stirred into cornmeal, buttermilk, and egg before it hit the hot greased skillet. But it softened the grit and gave the crust a faint caramel edge that belonged on a Sunday table. Kids who grew up eating sweetened cornbread could taste the difference at someone else's house. That pinch of sugar was a signature, a line drawn in batter that said, "This kitchen belongs to us." Long before the smokehouse went quiet, there was a sound on the streets of New Orleans that meant breakfast, a woman's voice in French Creole calling out over a basket balanced on her head, hot rice fritters rising from a cold brazier. Callous were the original banned soul food. Deep-fried rice cakes made from leftover rice, flour, eggs, sugar, and nutmeg, sold by black women in the French Quarter since the 1700s, when the Code Noir gave enslaved women Sundays off to sell food and earn their own money. By the 1920s, vending ordinances pushed the women off the streets. The city wanted cleaner sidewalks. What it erased was a tradition connecting back to West African rice culture, the Wolof and Mandinka peoples who cultivated the grain that built Louisiana's economy. Rose Nicole, the most famous calla seller, purchased her freedom with fritter money earned outside Sunday Mass. By the 1930s, the calla women were gone. The sound went with them. Nothing was wasted. The feet went into a pot with vinegar. The liver was sliced thin and fried with onions. The stomach was clean, turned inside out, scrubbed, and stuffed with potatoes. The tail fell apart in Sunday gravy. The ears were pickled. The skin was scored and roasted until it crackled. Health experts told black families to stop eating organ meats. Too much cholesterol, too much fat. What they ignored was that liver contains more bioavailable vitamin A, B12, and iron per ounce than any other food on earth. Heart meat is the richest natural source of coenzyme Q10, now sold in supplement bottles for $10 each. Pig feet and tails are dense with collagen, the same protein wellness companies now sell as powder for joint health. The whole animal, respected and consumed, delivered a nutritional profile that no boneless, skinless chicken breast could match. Those families ate snout to tail because they had to. Turns out they were eating better than anyone who chose not to. If fatback was the daily currency, the country ham hanging in the cellar was a savings account nobody touched until Christmas. Salt curing was a preservation method black families practiced with precision, rubbing coarse salt into whole hams, packing them tight, and hanging them from cellar rafters where cool air circulated for months. The World Health Organization classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen in 2015, and salt-cured ham landed on the list. But traditional dry curing uses no synthetic nitrates. The salt draws moisture from the meat, creating conditions where harmful bacteria cannot survive, a preservation science that predates refrigeration by centuries. A properly cured ham could hang for a year and come down richer than the day it went up. You knew it was ready by the feel of the surface, not a thermometer. You sliced it thin, fried it in its own fat, and made red-eye gravy with the drippings and black coffee. Before high fructose corn syrup colonized every grocery shelf, black families in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia grew their own sweetener. Salted and smoked meats for preservation were essential survival techniques in African American households long before refrigeration existed. Families cured pork with heavy salt, hung it in smokehouses, and stored it for months through entire winters. Health officials later warned these methods produced excessive sodium and carcinogenic compounds, pushing families toward processed alternatives. But recent science re-examined traditional smoking and found that cold smoking at low temperatures produced far fewer harmful compounds than industrial processing. The salt in home curing acted as a natural antimicrobial without chemical additives found in modern deli meats. Scientists now acknowledge traditionally smoked meats were safer and more nutritious than factory replacements. Frying in cast iron instead of non-stick pans was the only option in traditional African American kitchens, and science confirms this was superior choice. Cast iron retains heat exceptionally well, maintaining consistent oil temperature even when cold food is added, preventing greasy results from temperature drops. Heavy pans distribute heat evenly, eliminating hot spots that burn some pieces while undercooking others. Scientists documented that properly seasoned cast iron develops natural non-stick surface rivaling synthetic coatings without chemical concerns. The iron leaches small amounts of dietary iron into food, providing nutritional benefits modern cookware cannot offer. These pans pass through generations, gaining better seasoning with each use. What seemed stubborn tradition was wisdom about heat management. Putting a penny in the pot to keep greens green seemed like pure superstition to anyone outside African American kitchens, yet the technique actually worked through basic chemistry. Older copper pennies dropped into simmering greens released trace copper ions into cooking liquid. These ions interacted with chlorophyll molecules, stabilizing their structure and preventing color from turning dull olive during long cooking. Grandmothers noticed greens stayed vibrant and appetizing even after hours of simmering with ham hocks. Modern food science confirms copper does preserve chlorophyll, which is why commercial processors use copper compounds as color stabilizers. This hack proved that observation and experimentation in home kitchens could discover truths laboratory science would later validate. Using bacon grease to season cast iron skillets was the cornerstone of African American kitchen maintenance for generations. Grandmothers carefully saved rendered bacon fat in ceramic crocks kept near the stove, using it to coat skillets after each washing and before storage. Scientists now confirm that animal fats create superior polymerized seasoning layers compared to vegetable oils, bonding more effectively with iron at high temperatures. The practice produced naturally non-stick surfaces that improve with age and continued use. This technique was taught to daughters standing at their mother's elbows, watching simple pork fat transform rough metal into cooking treasures. The seasoned skillets became family heirlooms passed down through generations with pride. Marinating meat in buttermilk was a technique African American cooks used to transform tough, inexpensive cuts into tender meals that rivaled expensive steaks. Food scientists now understand that buttermilk's lactic acid gently breaks down muscle fibers without turning meat mushy, while calcium helps proteins retain moisture during cooking. Research confirms that buttermilk marinades penetrate deeper than vinegar, creating tenderness throughout rather than just on the surface. Grandmothers would submerge chicken pieces overnight before dredging in seasoned flour, producing fried chicken so tender it fell off the bone. What seemed like folk wisdom was precise food chemistry that restaurants now employ deliberately. Black cooks mastered meat tenderization through observation long before laboratories confirmed their methods. Number 20, saving and reusing bacon grease in a tin. A small metal can with a slotted lid sat on the back of every black grandmother's stove from Birmingham to Buffalo. Each morning's bacon went into the skillet and the runoff went into the can. The grease cooled, turned pale, and waited for the next supper. She greased her cornbread skillet with it, fried her okra in it, dropped a spoonful into a pot of cabbage. You could smell it warming from the next room. The 1980s war on saturated fat told her that tin was a death sentence. By 2014, the Annals of Internal Medicine reviewed 72 studies and found no consistent link between saturated fat and coronary disease. Her bacon grease cost nothing. It was shelf stable for months. The doctors who told her to throw it out had moved on to scolding sugar. Number 22, saccharin. By the 1970s, it had become the standby in countless black kitchens. The little tablets dropped into coffee and the powder stirred into pitchers of tea for anyone told to ease off the sugar. It was older than cyclamate and had outlasted it, the survivor of the artificial sweeteners. Then, in March of 1977, the FDA announced it intended to ban saccharin too, citing Canadian studies that found bladder cancer in male rats fed heavy doses. The outcry was immediate. Congress stepped in and saved the sweetener, but it did not let it off clean. Lawmakers signed the Saccharin Study and Labeling Act in November of 1977, forcing every package and product to carry a stark warning that it had caused cancer in lab animals. So the powder stayed on the table, but now it spoke a warning every time you reached for it. The sweetness our elders trusted came wrapped in a federal caution that followed it for decades. Number 20, pot liquor from collards. A heavy iron pot full of dark green leaves, a smoked turkey wing at the bottom, water to cover, simmered 3 hours until the leaves had given up everything they had. The broth at the bottom of that pot was nearly black, slick with fat and soft with iron. A cook in Charleston ladled it into a coffee mug and drank it standing at the stove. Children sopped it up with cornbread. Nobody threw a single drop away. Most of the soluble vitamins and minerals from the greens leach into that liquid, more vitamin K in 1 cup than your daily multivitamin used to deliver. White nutritionists in the 1970s called it pot juice and threw it down the drain. Black households strained it and saved it. They were right. They were right about the leaves, right about the broth, and right about every warning that told them to stop. The same cup she drank from a mason jar in 1962 now sells in Brooklyn juice bars for $9. Number 20, buttermilk soaking. Before you cook tough cuts of meat or wild game, you soak them in buttermilk overnight. Black women across the South knew this trick so deeply that it was never written down in any recipe. It lived in the hands, not on paper. The buttermilk tenderized the meat and extended its usable life by a full day or more. A tough piece of squirrel or rabbit that would have been like chewing rope came out of that buttermilk bath, soft enough to fall apart on the fork. Health departments said raw meat sitting in unrefrigerated buttermilk was a breeding ground for pathogens. They missed the point entirely. The lactic acid bacteria in buttermilk produce antimicrobial compounds, including bacteriocins and hydrogen peroxide. The pH drops low enough to inhibit harmful bacteria, while the enzymes break down tough connective tissue. Science now calls this biopreservation. Your grandmother called it getting the meat ready. Same process, different vocabulary. Nobody threw away the water left after greens finished cooking. That dark, fragrant liquid, thick with vitamins from hours of slow simmering, was called pot liquor, and Black mothers treated it like medicine. Jackie Torrance, the African-American storyteller, remembered her grandmother making pot liquor from mustard greens, pinto beans, and white potatoes, drinking it warm from a cup. The tradition reached back to West Africa, where dipping starchy foods into the liquid from boiled greens was standard practice, and it survived the Middle Passage and plantation kitchens without losing a generation. Families sopped it up with cornbread, fed it to sick children, and used it as a folk remedy for stomach trouble. Nutritionally, pot liquor contained concentrated vitamins A, C, and K, along with calcium and iron released during cooking. What the rest of the country poured down the drain, Black mothers saved and served the next morning. It cost nothing. It healed everything. The smell hit you before you saw the table. Sweet, sharp, slightly chemical, like summer fruit soaking in something your mother told you not to touch. Bathtub gin watermelon was the open secret of every rent party and backyard gathering in the 1920s. You cut a plug from a whole watermelon, poured in homemade gin until the fruit absorbed it, replaced the plug, and let it sit overnight. The gin seeped into the flesh, turning each bite cool and burning at the same time. You learned by watching your uncle work the knife on a Saturday afternoon while the yard filled with people who all knew the melon was not just melon. The gin was rough, juniper oil, and grain alcohol, but the fruit softened it, made it sweet enough to forget you were breaking. 2 laws at once, possession and distribution. That was what they called sharing a slice with your neighbor. Night meant the deep pot came out, heavy, blackened, filled with enough saved drippings to submerge a full batch of fish. She knew by the sound when to drop the first fillet. Public health waged war on deep frying, and they had a point about frequency. But the real damage came from the switch. When families replaced animal fats with cheap polyunsaturated vegetable oils, they introduced a worse problem. Polyunsaturated fats are unstable at high temperatures. They oxidize rapidly, producing aldehydes and lipid peroxides linked to chronic inflammation. Saturated and monounsaturated fats resist this breakdown and hold their structure without the same toxic byproducts. The fish that came out of your grandmother's pot, fried in animal fat she had been carefully maintaining, was chemically safer than the same fish fried once in fresh canola oil. She judged the temperature by dropping a pinch of flour and watching how fast it sizzled. No thermometer, just decades of standing over that pot, listening. Sorghum, a West African grain brought to the Americas through the slave trade, was pressed into syrup at small community mills, many Black-owned, and poured into mason jars that lined pantry shelves from harvest through spring. Food historian Michael Twitty documented sorghum as one of the most culturally significant crops in the African-American agricultural tradition, tracing it to grain syrups made in West Africa for centuries. Nutritional analysis shows sorghum syrup has a lower glycemic index than refined sugar and contains iron and B vitamins. She drizzled it over cornbread, stirred it into hot water for a morning tonic, and baked it into cakes darker and richer than anything white sugar could produce. When the last Black-owned mills closed in the 1980s, the jars stopped appearing, and a sweetness left the kitchen that no store-bought bottle could replace. The jar sat on the counter in plain sight, and if you did not grow up with it, you did not understand it. Eating organ meats like kidneys and hearts was a weekly occurrence in many African American homes, especially when families stretched every part of a butchered animal. Health authorities discouraged organ meat consumption for decades, warning about cholesterol and fat content. But nutritional science has reversed course, recognizing organ meats as some of the most nutrient-dense foods available. Kidneys are packed with B12 and selenium, while hearts provide concentrated coenzyme Q10, a compound modern supplements now market at premium prices. Black grandmothers who fried kidneys with onions or stewed hearts with gravy were delivering superfoods before the term existed. The very foods dismissed as poverty eating contain the exact nutrients wellness culture now celebrates. Preheating low and slow was essential wisdom that separated experienced cooks from beginners in Black kitchens of the 1950s. Grandmothers never rushed their cast iron, understanding that heavy pans needed time to heat evenly across their entire surface. A skillet placed over high flame developed hot spots that burned food in patches. Instead, the pan went over low heat for 15 minutes, the iron gradually absorbing warmth until every inch reached the same temperature. Only then would the flame increase. Children learned patience watching this process. The evenly heated surface meant chicken browned uniformly, cornbread developed consistent crust, and nothing stuck. This technique protected the seasoning too, preventing thermal shock that could damage the finish. The slow approach extended the pan's life across generations. Rubbing meat with salt and letting it sit before cooking was a practice African American cooks inherited from generations of knowledge about making tough cuts tender and flavorful. Hours before cooking, grandmothers generously salted pork chops, chicken pieces, or beef roasts, then let them rest uncovered. Salt drew moisture to the surface initially, then that brine was reabsorbed deep into muscle fibers, carrying flavor and breaking down proteins. Modern chefs call this dry brining, and food science confirms salt denatures proteins, allowing them to hold more water and preventing dry, tough results. African American cooks perfected this technique out of necessity, transforming cheap cuts into satisfying meals that sustained working families. Placing a wooden spoon across boiling pots to prevent overflow was a technique every African American grandmother seemed to know instinctively. When pasta water or milk threatened to bubble over, laying a wooden spoon across the pot's rim would mysteriously calm the foam. Food scientists have since explained that wood's dry surface destabilizes bubbles on contact, while the spoon's temperature causes rapid bubble collapse. This hack saved countless stovetops from sticky messes and allowed multitasking cooks to attend other duties without constant watching. Grandmothers would position their spoons and turn to other tasks, confident their pots would behave. Children watched this seeming magic and learned that traditional knowledge often outpaced scientific understanding. Soaking dried beans overnight was a ritual African American cooks performed religiously, though food scientists once insisted the practice was unnecessary habit. Research now confirms that overnight soaking reduces compounds called oligosaccharides that cause digestive discomfort while decreasing cooking time and improving nutrient absorption. Scientists discovered that soaked beans retain more minerals and produce creamier textures because water penetrates tough outer skins before heat is applied. Grandmothers would set their beans to soak before bed, knowing morning would bring a pot ready for slow cooking with ham hocks. The practice also reduced phytic acid that blocks mineral absorption. What seemed like simple kitchen routine was actually sophisticated food preparation that maximized both nutrition and digestibility. Number 19, hand grinding cornmeal with the germ left in. A small cast iron grinder bolted to the kitchen table in a sharecropper's house outside Marion, Alabama in 1949. She poured a cup of dried corn into the hopper and turned the crank, and the meal came out coarse and oily and pale yellow. The corn germ, the small embryo at the center of every kernel, carried the niacin, the magnesium, the vitamin E, and the unsaturated fat that the kernel needed to sprout. Industrial milling stripped the germ out so the meal would not go rancid on the grocery shelf. Her cornbread was made with the whole kernel, and her household did not get pellagra during the years pellagra swept across the South and killed thousands of poor families on a refined corn diet. The county nutritionist who came through in 1953 told her stone ground cornmeal was old-fashioned. She kept grinding. By 2017, the USDA was publishing pamphlets advising whole grain cornmeal for fiber, magnesium, and B vitamins. They called it heart healthy. The germ she ground into every batch was now in glossy print as the reason. She wasn't impressed. She was 84 and still standing at the grinder twice a week. And the granddaughter she taught the trick to was running her cornmeal through a stand mixer in Atlanta. Her grinder weighed 11 pounds. It was a wedding gift from her mother in 1932. The wood handle had been replaced twice. The iron mechanism hadn't. She kept it oiled with a drop of bacon fat at the joint, and the meal it produced still tasted faintly of the corn the kernel had been. A sack of stone ground meal at the Natural Grocery in Birmingham in 2018 ran $9 for 2 pounds. Her grinder paid for itself in 18 months. The kernel had carried itself across 4 generations because one grandmother refused to throw away the part the cookbook said to discard. Number 20, small turtles under 4 inches. Snapping turtle and pond turtle were honest food in many Southern Black households, caught from the creek and cooked into stews and fried turtle that stretched a week's eating. Children kept the tiny ones in dime store bowls, and the small turtle trade boomed in pet shops nationwide. The trouble was salmonella. The little turtles carried it on their shells, and outbreaks of it kept landing children in hospitals across the country. In 1975, the FDA banned the sale of any turtle with a shell under 4 inches long, the size that ended up in a child's hands and then a child's mouth. The rule did not touch the big turtles cooked for the pot, but it gutted the trade in the small ones and reshaped how families could keep them. A creature that had fed and entertained folks for generations got its smallest version pulled from every shelf to stop the spread of a kitchen sickness. Number 19, turnip greens with stems. The pot took the whole plant, the leafy tops, the bitter stems, the small white roots, all of it together in a heavy iron pot with smoked meat and a splash of cider vinegar at the end. A cook in Tuskegee in 1955 stood over that pot for hours, lifting the lid every so often, adjusting the heat with the air vent on the wood stove. She didn't have a peer-reviewed paper to wave around. She had a heavy pot, a smoked turkey wing, and 40 years of doing it the way her mother did it. The 1985 dietary climate told families to skip greens cooked in fat and reach for raw salads instead. What that advice missed is that the fat is what unlocks the carotenoids in the leaf. The pot in Tuskegee already knew. It had been doing the work for centuries, and it kept working the day the chart was published, and it kept working the day the chart was retired. 19, sun-drying fruit on tin roofs. This was summer's most important chore in the Black South, and nobody treated it lightly. In July and August, Black women in Georgia and the Carolinas sliced peaches, apples, and figs and laid them out on clean cloth atop tin roofs that baked in the summer sun. The heat and airflow removed moisture until the fruit turned leathery, like soft candy, and could be stored in cotton sacks through the coldest months. The process took 2 or 3 days, depending on the thickness of the slices. Women checked the fruit every few hours, turning the pieces to dry evenly and chasing off insects. Children were assigned to watch the trays and shoo away birds. It was a family operation with real consequences. If you did not dry enough fruit in July, your family had no fruit in January. That was not an inconvenience. That was a gap in the diet that nothing else could fill. The USDA advised against sun drying because it could not guarantee consistent temperatures or protection from contamination. They recommended electric dehydrators that cost more than some families earned in a month. But the tin roofs reached temperatures above 140 degrees on a July afternoon. That is the exact threshold the USDA now recommends for safe dehydration. The women were hitting the target without ever reading the manual. The tin roof was doing the same work as a $200 appliance, using nothing but sunlight. A church woman in Savannah dried enough peaches every summer to fill her pantry through Christmas. She gave bags of dried fruit as gifts the way other people gave cards. Neighbors came by in October asking if she had any peaches left. She always did. She had been doing it since the 1930s. Her peaches never made anyone sick, not once in 50 years. That tin roof was her dehydrator. The sun was free. The knowledge was what cost something. Cheapest cuts arrived, tough and stubborn, but your mother knew how to break them. She filled a bowl with white vinegar mixed with water, sometimes adding crushed garlic or black pepper, and submerged the meat overnight. By morning, the acid had softened connective tissue and broken down fibers that made cheap beef chewy. Wesley Jones, a formerly enslaved man from South Carolina, described a vinegar and pepper sauce used by enslaved people to tenderize smoked meats, a practice documented in Works Progress Administration interviews during the 1930s. That technique traveled through generations, landing in 1960s kitchens where a bottle of vinegar sat next to the stove as permanently as the salt. The hack turned cuts, costing pennies per pound, into meals that fell apart at the touch. Butchers sold the toughest parts cheap because they assumed nobody wanted them. Black mothers bought them on purpose, knowing vinegar and thyme could transform what others threw away. When the first frost hit and the persimmons went soft on the branch, the brewing started. Persimmon beer was older than Prohibition, older than the country, rooted in indigenous American and West African fermentation traditions. Black families gathered the fruit after cold sweetened it, mashed it with wheat, bran, molasses, and water, then let it ferment in crocks until it turned fizzy and tart. The flavor was earthy, sweet, with a tang that caught the back of your throat. The Volstead Act banned beer production at home, even while allowing fruit wine. Persimmon beer fell on the wrong side of that line. What had been a seasonal ritual tied to the rhythm of the land became criminal overnight. Crocks got buried behind barns and hen houses. The recipe got whispered instead of spoken aloud. When the old ones who remembered the right ratio of fruit to grain finally passed on, nobody could ask them to say it one more time. The beer with them. The smokehouse stood out back, small and dark, with hams hanging from hooks in the ceiling. Salt had been rubbed into the meat by hand, packed deep into every crevice, and then the wood was lit, hickory mostly, and smoke curled around the cuts for days. Health authorities linked salt-cured meats to blood pressure and cancer risk. But the science behind the technique is sound. Salt draws moisture through osmosis, reducing water activity below the threshold where bacteria like Clostridium botulinum can survive. Phenolic compounds in wood smoke act as natural antioxidants, preventing fat from going rancid, and as antimicrobials, forming a protective barrier on the surface. Those families were practicing food safety before the term existed. The smokehouse kept meat edible for months without electricity or refrigeration, just salt, smoke, time, and knowledge passed down through hands that never read a textbook. Pickled pig feet, trotters simmered until tender, then submerged in a sharp vinegar brine with bay leaves, peppercorns, and hot pepper flakes, filled gallon glass jars across black households from the 1940s through the 70s. Health inspectors flagged them. Nutritionists dismissed them as waste cuts. But pig feet are one of the richest natural sources of collagen type 2, along with glycine and proline, amino acids now sold as expensive supplements for joint health and gut lining repair. The vinegar brine created an acidic environment that prevented bacterial growth while tenderizing connective tissue into something silky. You ate them cold, straight from the jar, pulling soft meat from between small bones with your teeth while the vinegar stung your lips. Nobody taught you how. You watched, and one day you reached in. She bought them by the bag, 5-10 pounds at a time, and stacked them in the freezer like she was preparing for something only she could see coming. Black walnut cooking and baking was a cherished autumn tradition in African American families, especially in the Upper South where wild trees grew abundantly. Families gathered fallen nuts, cracked them by hand, and used the rich meat in cakes, cookies, and candy treats. Commercial production ignored black walnuts in favor of milder English walnuts, dismissing the wild variety as too bitter. But research revealed black walnuts contain significantly higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and anti-inflammatory compounds than commercial counterparts. The bitterness that made them unpopular signaled polyphenols now linked to heart health and cancer prevention. Families who foraged these stubborn nuts were harvesting one of nature's most powerful health foods. Adding a splash of vinegar to buttermilk marinades was a subtle technique transforming ordinary fried chicken into something extraordinary. African American cooks discovered extra acid, tenderized tough cuts more effectively than buttermilk alone while enhancing flavor penetration. The acidic environment breaks down proteins on meat's surface, creating texture, holding breading better, and developing deeper browning during frying. Scientists confirm acid marinades denature proteins, improving moisture retention and tenderness without turning meat mushy. The vinegar balanced richness of fried foods, adding brightness cutting through fat. This small addition made the difference between good and legendary fried chicken, a secret passed between generations without explanation, just faithful instruction. Cooking fish in buttermilk before frying was essential preparation in African American kitchens, especially when dealing with catfish pulled fresh from rivers and ponds. Fish rested in buttermilk anywhere from 30 minutes to overnight, depending on how strong the flavor needed taming. Buttermilk's acidity broke down surface proteins, tenderizing flesh, while its cultures neutralized muddy or fishy taste freshwater fish sometimes carried. The milk proteins also help cornmeal coating adhere better, creating crispier crust that stayed put during frying. Modern food science confirms acidic marinades denature surface proteins for better texture and breading adhesion. This hack transformed humble catches into celebrated dishes that became centerpieces of fish fries and family gatherings. Storing bread with celery stalks to maintain freshness was an African American pantry trick that produced remarkable results in households across the country. Grandmothers would place a stalk or two inside bread boxes and storage bags, somehow extending the loaf's softness by several days beyond what seemed possible. Modern food scientists now understand that celery releases moisture at a rate that perfectly balances bread's tendency to dry out without promoting mold growth. The celery sacrificed itself, becoming dry while the bread stayed fresh. This technique was valuable in households where bread was baked weekly and needed to last between baking days. Women traded this knowledge at church gatherings, perfecting the ratio through shared experience. Adding vinegar to cooking greens was dismissed as peculiar taste preference, yet African American cooks insisted the splash of acid made vegetables more nutritious. Scientists now confirm that vinegar helps preserve vitamins during cooking, prevents color loss, and increases absorption of minerals like iron and calcium from leafy vegetables. Research shows that acidic environments protect certain nutrients from heat degradation while breaking down plant cell walls to release others. Grandmothers added their splash of apple cider or white vinegar toward the end of cooking, timing perfected through generations. The tang balanced the richness of smoked meat and cut through natural bitterness. What seemed like arbitrary seasoning was actually nutritional optimization that maximized what bodies could extract from every pot. Number 18, smothering cabbage low and slow on the stove. A green head of cabbage shredded thin, dropped into a heavy pan with a tablespoon of bacon grease, a half cup of water, and a pinch of black pepper. She put a lid on the pan and walked away for 40 minutes. The cabbage softened, the water cooked off, and the leaves caramelized into a golden brown heap. You could smell the sweetness from the porch. Cabbage is part of the cruciferous family. It carries glucosinolates, sulfur compounds. The modern research links to lower colon cancer rates in your gut. Long, gentle cooking with a small amount of fat made the fat-soluble nutrients absorbable to your body, the way a tea bag releases its color in hot water. The 1990s low-fat advice told her to steam it dry. The steam version passed through your body without releasing much of anything. Her smothered version filled a plate for 9 cents. A black grandmother in 1957 wasn't following a diet. She was running a household on a paycheck that ran short by Wednesday. The pantry held what the white grocer would sell at the back door. What most people miss about your grandmother's cooking is that the methods were never chosen because a doctor had recommended them. They were chosen because they stretched the food. 40 years later, the doctors caught up. They published the studies. They ran the trials. They called the old methods heart healthy and gut healthy and anti-inflammatory. Your grandmother had been cooking that way since 1923. The science wasn't new. It was just finally written down. Number 19, raw unpasteurized milk. Before the refrigerated truck and the grocery dairy case, country families drank their milk straight from the cow and they let it sit and sour on purpose. That soured milk became clabber, thick and tangy, spooned up plain or stirred into cornbread and biscuits across the rural South. Real buttermilk came the same honest way. Raw milk was the foundation of half the baking in a poor kitchen. But unpasteurized milk can carry listeria, E. coli, and salmonella, and the sicknesses it caused were severe, sometimes deadly, especially in the young and the old. So the agency drew a hard line. In 1987, the FDA banned the sale of raw milk across state lines, requiring pasteurization for any milk shipped in interstate commerce. The clabber and the true buttermilk did not vanish, but the easy supply of raw milk that fed those traditions was cut off by federal rule, pushing a cornerstone of country cooking to the margins. Number 18, mustard greens with vinegar. A cook in Macon in 1962 finished her pot the same way her own mother had finished it in 1898. She shook a bottle of cider vinegar over the top 3 times, no measuring, and let the splash fall through the simmer. The vinegar was not for flavor alone. The acid pulled the calcium out of the leaf in a form your body could absorb, the same way lemon juice does in Mediterranean cooking. By 1992, the dish was banned from low-fat cookbooks. The fat was the problem, the editors said. The fat was the reason families were getting sick. By 2024, the same combination, fat plus greens plus acid, was being recommended in cardiology newsletters as a calcium absorption strategy. The cook in Macon was not in the newsletter. Her pot did not get cited. 3 centuries of that splash of vinegar in that pot, and the science arrived 3 centuries late. Your aunt still cooks it the same way. Her pot doesn't need a citation. Number 18, ash lye hominy. This is the one that regulators tried hardest to stop. Black families in the Deep South soaked dried corn kernels in a solution of water and hardwood ash to make hominy. The lye from the ash dissolved the tough outer hull of the corn and transformed it into something softer, larger, and far more nutritious. The process is called the nixtamalization. Nobody in rural Alabama used that word. They called it making lye hominy. Public health officials banned the sale of homemade lye hominy in several states by the 1970s because lye is caustic and improperly prepared batches could cause chemical burns. The caution was not unreasonable, but the technique itself was brilliant. Nixtamalization releases niacin that is otherwise locked inside the corn. Without it, communities that depend on corn develop pellagra, a devastating deficiency disease. Indigenous peoples knew this thousands of years ago. Black families inherited the knowledge and kept it alive. Scientists did not fully explain the biochemistry until the late 20th century. The women who made lye hominy every fall were preventing a disease they had never heard of. When the government said stop, families who listened got sicker. Families who kept their ash hoppers in the backyard did not. A single ham hock could season a pot of beans large enough to feed 8 people for 2 days, and your mother never apologized for there being no sliced ham on the plate. In black households during the 1960s, meat was a flavor agent, not a centerpiece. A few strips of fatback gave an entire pot of greens their richness. A neck bone lent body to soup that was mostly vegetables and broth. The old folk song Ham Bone referenced this directly, singing about a bone traveling from kitchen to kitchen because even bare bone still carried flavor. This was economics turned into art. When beef cost more than a family could spend on a Tuesday, the answer was not to skip meat, but to use a small amount so skillfully that every spoonful tasted full. The technique came from West African one-pot traditions where dried fish or smoked meat flavored large communal stews. Nobody at the table felt poor. That was the whole point. In the 1920s, when Southern game laws tightened on rural black communities, rabbit hunting moved to the dark hours. The stew was not fancy: quartered rabbit, browned in lard, simmered with onions, potatoes, and herbs that grew along the fence line. But it held defiance in every bite. Rabbits bred fast and lived everywhere, the most democratic protein in the South. A box trap from scrap wood and a handful of clover would do. But regulations required licenses, and in Alabama and Mississippi, wardens used those laws to control black movement off tenant farms. A man caught with a rabbit and no license could be jailed, which often meant convict labor. So the hunts moved to moonless nights, traps set where no warden walked. The women who cooked that stew never asked where the rabbit came from. They seasoned the pot and fed the household. That silence was its own kind of grace. Before the supplement aisle existed, there was a quieter kind of kitchen science, one that saved civilizations. Women took dried field corn and soaked it in lye water made from hardwood ashes, stirring with long wooden paddles as the kernels swelled and the hulls loosened. What emerged was hominy, puffed, white, tender enough to eat whole or grind into grits. The process, learned from Native American neighbors as early as the 1800s, is called nixtamalization. Europeans who brought corn across the Atlantic skipped this step, and over 100,000 Americans died from pellagra, a niacin deficiency caused by corn that locks away its B3 behind chemical bonds the body cannot break without alkaline processing. Nixtamalization releases that bound niacin, increases calcium by 750%, improves protein quality, and destroys 90% of mycotoxins. The women who stirred that lye pot were performing biochemistry. They just called it making hominy. Smoked the neck bones with the cheapest cuts at the butcher counter, and a single bag could flavor 3 separate pots of greens, beans, or rice over the course of a week. The World Health Organization's 2015 classification of processed meats put smoked cuts on the danger list, and neck bones, smoked over hickory, in the tradition passed from plantation smokehouses to backyard pits, were caught in the warning. But slow smoking creates phenolic compounds that act as natural antioxidants, and the bones release collagen, calcium, and marrow nutrients during the long simmer. The smoke was the seasoning, the bone was the nutrition, and the grandmother who kept the freezer stocked was the reason nobody went hungry. She pulled 2 from the bag on Monday, dropped them in the pot, and by Wednesday, the house smelled like something you will spend your whole life trying to find again. They came home from the garden in buckets, dried on newspapers spread across the porch, and went into cotton sacks that hung from nails in the cooking in unlined cast iron pots was the standard in African American kitchens for generations, with heavy skillets and Dutch ovens passed down like heirlooms. When non-stick coatings and aluminum pans arrived, cast iron was labeled old-fashioned. Health officials raised concerns about iron leaching into food, but scientists discovered that cooking in cast iron provides beneficial dietary iron, particularly important for populations at risk of anemia. The seasoned surface from years of cooking with animal fats formed a natural nonstick coating far safer than synthetic chemicals in modern pans. Recent studies linked chemicals in nonstick coatings to serious health concerns, making grandmother's trusted cast iron look smarter with every passing year. Letting battered foods rest before frying seemed counterintuitive when crispy results were desired. Yet, African American cooks knew this pause produced superior texture. After coating chicken or fish in flour, pieces were set aside for 10 to 15 minutes before entering hot oil. This resting period allowed flour to hydrate and form paste-like coating, adhering better during frying and developing more substantial crunch. Scientists explain hydrated flour creates stronger gluten networks resisting separation during cooking and crisping more evenly. The technique allowed excess coating to settle, preventing clumps frying unevenly or falling into oil. Grandmothers prepared large batches, and natural wait time created this beneficial rest. What seemed inefficiency was technique refined through generations. Adding a splash of coffee to chocolate desserts was a secret weapon in African American baking that confused anyone who tasted the results but could not identify the mystery ingredient. Grandmothers stirred small amounts of strong black coffee into chocolate cake batters, brownie mixes, and puddings without the final product tasting like coffee at all. The caffeine and compounds in coffee amplified chocolate flavor, making it taste richer without adding more cocoa. This technique allowed families to stretch expensive chocolate further while achieving deeper results. Food scientists now understand that coffee contains compounds that enhance chocolate perception by activating the same taste receptors. Professional pastry chefs regularly use this trick today. Using coffee grounds to deodorize refrigerators was standard practice in African American households decades before commercial deodorizers existed. Grandmothers would place bowls of spent grounds on refrigerator shelves where they absorbed odors from onions, fish, and leftovers with remarkable effectiveness. Scientists have since confirmed that coffee's porous structure and nitrogen content make it exceptionally effective at trapping volatile odor compounds. The grounds work better than baking soda for many strong smells. This hack recycled kitchen waste into a cleaning solution, exemplifying the waste-nothing philosophy of resourceful households. Women who couldn't afford commercial products created their own solutions, proving that ingenuity could replace spending. Letting batter rest before frying was a step many modern cooks skip, yet African American grandmothers insisted the wait made all the difference in crunch and texture. Food scientists now confirm that resting allows gluten strands to relax, starches to hydrate fully, and air bubbles to stabilize, creating lighter, crispier coatings. Research shows rested batters absorb less oil during frying because their structure is more cohesive. Grandmothers would mix their cornmeal coating, then attend to other kitchen tasks while the mixture transformed. The resulting fried chicken and catfish emerged with crust that shattered between teeth rather than turning soggy. What seemed like patience forced by busy kitchens was deliberate technique that improved texture and reduced oil absorption. Number 16, simmering smoked turkey necks in place of fatback. A package of smoked turkey necks bought from the meat counter in Atlanta 3 pounds for under $2 in 1981. She had begun swapping out the salt pork her own mother used. Smoked turkey carried the same depth of flavor with a third of the saturated fat and half the sodium. She seasoned the greens with one neck instead of a hock, simmered for 2 hours, and the broth came out richer and lighter at once. Her doctor had not asked her to change. She had read a pamphlet at the senior center and decided on the swap on her own. The American Heart Association in 2018 published a recipe modification guide that recommended exactly this swap as a strategy for elder Black households at higher risk for hypertension. She had been doing it for 37 years before they wrote it down. Number 18, brominated vegetable oil. This one hid in plain sight the additive that kept the citrus flavor from floating to the top in orange and lemon lime sodas. Those bright bottles were a fixture at the cookout and the church picnic, lined up in the cooler beside the sweet tea, and brominated vegetable oil was what kept them looking right. Most folks drinking them never knew the name, but bromine builds up in the body over time, and studies done with the National Institutes of Health found it could harm the heart and the thyroid at the levels people actually consumed. The evidence finally tipped the scale. On July 3rd, 2024, the FDA revoked the rule that had allowed brominated vegetable oil in food, ordering it out of the soda supply for good. An ingredient that had ridden along in our drinks for decades, doing its quiet job, was pulled the moment the science caught up with it. Number 17, dandelion greens salad. Every spring, a woman in rural Tennessee walked the back lot with a paring knife in her apron pocket, looking for the young leaves before they bloomed. She cut them low, washed them in cold water, and tossed them with hot bacon grease, cider vinegar, a pinch of sugar, and a hard-boiled egg crumbled on top. Dandelion greens carry more vitamin A per cup than spinach, plus inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds the bacteria in your gut. The 1980s called dandelions a lawn problem and recommended weed killer. By 2018, specialty grocers were selling the same leaves for $4 a bunch. Jessica B. Harris, the food historian, has written that this is the cycle of African American foodways. What the family ate became what the family was told to stop eating, became what the food world rediscovered, always in that order. The woman in Tennessee never stopped. She kept walking the same back lot with the same paring knife in the same apron pocket every spring for 60 years. 17, burying vegetables in sand. Sweet potatoes, turnips, and beets were layered in wooden crates with damp sand between each row, then stored in a root cellar or buried in a pit dug into the earth. The sand held just enough moisture to prevent shriveling, but not enough to encourage rot. It worked like a thermostat made of earth. Your family could pull fresh vegetables from that crate in February that had been buried since October. They tasted almost as fresh as the day they went into the ground. County agents called it unsanitary because soil contact could introduce bacteria. But the sand was not soil. It was a humidity control system, as precise in its own way as a walk-in cooler. Modern cold storage facilities use the same principle, controlled humidity between 85 and 95% at temperatures just above freezing. A hole in the ground in Georgia maintained roughly those conditions from November through March without a single kilowatt of electricity. Number 16, cane syrup preserving. In the sugarcane belt of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, Black families poured thick cane syrup over fruits and sometimes meats to preserve them. The syrup's sugar concentration was so high that it pulled water out of any bacteria that landed on the surface, killing them through osmotic pressure. The same principle makes honey one of the only foods that never spoils. Nutritionists in the 20th century dismissed syrup preservation as nothing more than candy making and warned it was too high in sugar to be considered a legitimate food safety practice. But osmotic preservation is now a recognized method in food science. The sugar concentration in cane syrup exceeds 60%, which is well above the threshold needed to prevent microbial growth. Those families were practicing the same science that keeps your store-bought jam safe on the shelf for years. The jar was different, the chemistry was identical. A pinch of baking soda dropped into soaking beans the night before was a kitchen secret that traveled by mouth and never appeared in a single cookbook your mother owned. Black women across the South and the northern cities they migrated to knew that baking soda softened bean skins, cut cooking time nearly in half, and reduced the digestive trouble that kept some people from eating beans at all. The alkaline environment weakens pectin in cell walls, allowing water to penetrate faster and heat to distribute evenly. A pot of pintos that normally took 3 hours could be ready in under 2. During the 1960s, when dried beans cost a few cents per pound and provided more protein per dollar than almost anything else, this hack was survival arithmetic. Your mother added the soda without explanation. You only learned it was there when you tried making beans on your own, and they came out hard, and you called her, and she laughed before she told you. She set up before dawn, oil heating in cast iron, cornmeal in a paper sack, catfish fillets on yesterday's newspaper. By the time the sun hit the porch, there would be a line. Selling fried fish from the front porch was how black women fed neighborhoods and paid rent through the 1920s, where Jim Crow shut them out of wage work. 15 cents bought a plate, fish, coleslaw, cornbread, hot sauce, no license, no sign, just the smell pulling people from 3 blocks away. By mid-decade, cities like Philadelphia required vendors to obtain licenses and submit to inspections, with fines up to $50, a fortune for a woman earning pennies per plate. The rules landed hardest on black women who had built entire economies from their kitchens. Some paid the fee and kept frying. Others moved indoors, sold quieter. The plates got smaller. The lines got shorter. She cut the skin into strips, dropped them into hot fat, and waited. They hissed and curled, and by the time she fished them out with a slotted spoon, they were so crisp they shattered between your teeth. Kids fought over pieces still warm from the pot. Cracklings were dismissed as junk food, pure fat, zero nutritional value. But pork skin is roughly 85% collagen by a dry weight. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the body, essential for joint health, gut lining, skin elasticity, and bone density. The wellness industry now sells hydrolyzed collagen powder for $30 to $50 a container. Your grandmother rendered hers for free on Saturday afternoon in a cast iron pot. The Cracklins kids snatched off the paper towel before they cooled were delivering the same protein people now stir into their smoothies and call self-care. But long before the collagen craze, pantry, dried field peas, Crowder peas, lady peas, Sea Island reds, and heirloom varieties tracing directly to the cowpeas of West Africa were the protein backbone of black households when meat was scarce. Paired with rice, they form a complete protein, something nutritional science did not confirm until the 1970s, but these kitchens had practiced for generations. The resistant starch in dried peas feeds beneficial gut bacteria and lowers blood sugar response. A 5-pound sack lasted a family a month. You soaked them overnight, cooked them with whatever smoked meat was in the freezer, and served them over rice with cornbread on the side. She grew varieties no seed catalog carried. Seeds passed from her mother, from her grandmother, from hands that planted them in soil they were not allowed to own. The tin had no label anyone remembered choosing. It just appeared every fall after the cane was pressed at the mill down the road, and it did not leave the shelf until the last drop was scraped out in March. Raw honey and home remedies and cooking was a trusted practice in African American households, used to soothe sore throats, dress minor wounds, and sweeten teas and baked goods. Health officials warned against unpasteurized honey for decades, citing bacterial contamination risks and advising only commercially processed varieties. But modern research validated what folk medicine always taught. Raw honey contains powerful antibacterial enzymes, antioxidants, and prebiotics that pasteurization destroys. Studies show raw honey is effective against antibiotic-resistant bacteria and supports wound healing in clinical settings. The grandmothers who spooned raw honey into tea and spread it on burns were practicing evidence-based medicine before the term existed. Gravy-making mastery depended on cast iron's form, the brown bits stuck to the pan that formed the flavor foundation. Black cooks in the 1960s understood that real gravy started with what remained after frying meat, and no pan held fawn-like cast iron. After chicken or pork chops were removed, flour was sprinkled into the hot drippings and stirred until browned. Milk or broth was added gradually, the mixture thickening as it absorbed those caramelized meat flavors. The resulting gravy tasted like the dish it accompanied because it was built from the same ingredients. This wasn't gravy from a packet. It was gravy earned through proper cooking technique. Biscuits swimming in this gravy became meals themselves. The skillet's textured surface held form better than smooth modern pans ever could. Adding a pinch of sugar to tomato sauces was automatic in African American kitchens where grandmothers understood balance even without formal culinary training. Just a small amount, rarely more than a teaspoon per pot, went into tomato-based dishes, from stewed tomatoes to red gravy to barbecue sauce. Sugar did not make the sauce taste sweet, but cut the harsh acidity tomatoes naturally contain, creating smoother, rounder flavor. This technique was especially important with canned tomatoes, which can taste sharp without adjustment. Modern food science explains that sugar molecules interact with acid molecules on the tongue, reducing perception of sourness without eliminating bright tomato flavor. Professional chefs call this balancing acidity, something African American cooks achieved through generations of tasting. Applying mayonnaise to remove water stains from wooden furniture was an African American remedy that furniture experts now endorse. Grandmothers would spread mayonnaise over white rings left by wet glasses, cover with cloth, and let it sit overnight, revealing restored wood by morning. Food scientists understand that mayonnaise's combination of oil and vinegar penetrates wood grain, rehydrating dried fibers, while mild acid dissolves mineral deposits. This technique saved countless tables from permanent damage without expensive refinishing. The hack required only pantry staples and patience, making it accessible to any household. Women passed this knowledge through generations, rescuing precious furniture that represented significant family investments. Cooking with smoked meat for seasoning was criticized as adding unnecessary fat to healthy vegetables. Yet African American cooks understood something deeper about nutrition. Scientists now recognize that smoke contains compounds with antimicrobial properties while adding complex flavors impossible to replicate artificially. Research confirms that small amounts of smoked pork provide essential amino acids that transform plant-based meals into complete proteins. Ham hocks, bacon ends, and smoked turkey necks added collagen that promoted gut health. Grandmothers knew exactly how much meat was needed to season an entire pot of beans or greens, stretching precious protein while maximizing flavor. What dietitians once condemned, nutrition science, now acknowledges as intuitive understanding of how flavor and nutrition work together. Number 17, making sweet potatoes by hand with the skin on. A bushel of sweet potatoes pulled from the garden behind a shotgun house in Holly Springs, Mississippi, scrubbed under a cold tap. She didn't peel them. She baked them whole in a low oven for 90 minutes until the skins blistered and the orange flesh ran with sugar like honey. She ate the skins along with the meat. Your grandmother knew the same. The skin of a sweet potato carries a heavy share of the fiber, the potassium, and the chlorogenic acid the modern research links to lower blood pressure. The 1960s home economics pamphlets told her to peel everything. The peel went in the compost. By 2020, dietitians at Tufts were urging Americans to eat sweet potato skins for the polyphenols. She had not stopped. Her grandchildren walked into the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, and you could smell caramelizing yam and salt all the way to the porch. Number 17, lead glazed earthenware. The handsome clay pots and bean crocks that came up from Mexico and out of old country kilns carried a danger nobody could see. That bright glassy glaze got its shine from lead, and when it was not fired hot enough, the lead never fully fused. Pour something acidic into one, a pot of beans, a stew with tomato, a jug of tea left to sit, and the lead leached straight into the food. Families used these vessels for years, prizing them for their looks, never knowing they were seasoning every meal with poison. Lead does its worst damage to children and the unborn, dulling the mind in ways that never come back. The FDA moved to block it, prohibiting any cookware that leaches lead from being sold or imported, and ordering tainted pottery seized at the border. A pot that looked like heritage and beauty turned out to be a slow poison pulled from the shelves to protect the youngest at the table. Number 16, kale with smoked turkey. A church kitchen in Atlanta in 1962 poured broth over a pile of curly leaves and let them simmer with smoked turkey wings until the fat dissolved into the pot. The greens went onto a long folding table beside cornbread and sweet tea. The supper started at 6. The dishes were washed by 9. Everybody went home full. Kale is a brassica, the same family as broccoli, and the slow simmer makes its iron available in a way a raw salad cannot. For decades, white restaurants put kale beside fish as garnish food. Black church suppers cooked it as a meal. The 2010 wellness boom acted like kale was a discovery. It was not. The supper at the church in Atlanta in 1962 had been serving it for years, with smoked turkey, with cornbread on the side, with iced tea sweet enough to make your teeth hurt. Nothing about that supper has been improved by the wellness industry. The branding has been improved. The food is the same. Number 15, salt brine, fish preservation. Along the rivers and coastlines of the South, Black families caught more fish than they could eat in a single day. Catfish, bream, crappie, whatever the river offered. But without refrigeration, fish spoiled faster than almost any other food. So the surplus went into a crock of heavily salted water, packed tight with enough salt to make the brine feel thick on your fingers. The brine penetrated the flesh and dropped the water activity to a level where spoilage organisms could not survive. When your family needed protein, you pulled a piece from the brine, soaked it in fresh water to draw out the excess salt, and cooked it as if it had come straight from the river. Fried saltfish with grits and onions was a breakfast that fed families along the Carolina coast for generations. Regulators said home brining was inconsistent and risky. Modern food Scientists confirmed that salt concentrations above 10% effectively halt bacterial growth. The women who packed fish in crocks every summer did not measure water activity. They tasted the brine. If it was salty enough to pucker your lips, it was salty enough to keep the fish safe. The tongue was their instrument. She'll hit you before you saw what she was doing. Flour in a dry cast iron skillet, no oil, no butter, just heat and patience while she stirred with a wooden spoon until the powder turned from white to tan to the color of peanut shells. Browning flour separately gave gravy a depth that raw flour stirred into drippings could never reach, a toasted, nutty flavor that sat underneath the richness of meat. Leah Chase, the queen of Creole cuisine, whose New Orleans restaurant hosted civil rights strategy sessions in the 1960s, built her legendary dishes on this same dark roux. In kitchens from Mississippi to Chicago, Black mothers used the technique for cream gravy, brown gravy, and the thick sauce that smothered pork chops until they surrendered. You cannot time it with a clock, you time it with your eyes. And once she stopped standing at that skillet, nobody's gravy tasted right again. But one morning, the porch was just a porch again. If you did not grow up picking muscadines off the vine in late summer, you would never understand the wine. Thick, sweet, almost musky, with skin so tough you popped each grape between your teeth before the juice ran out. In Black households across the South, muscadine wine was as common as sweet tea. The grapes grew wild on fences from Virginia to Texas, and winemaking was simple: crushed grapes, sugar, water, thyme. No yeast needed because the wild bloom on the skins did the work. The Volstead Act permitted fruit wine at home, but enforcement was selective. Agents who let white folk press wine in California raided Black homes in Georgia over a single jug. So muscadine moved to the back of the pantry. The jug got a label that said vinegar. Sunday dinner kept its sweetness quietly behind closed doors. The pot never really stopped. Monday, sauté roast chicken left behind a carcass that went straight into water with an onion, a few peppercorns, and whatever scraps she had saved through the week. It simmered for a day, sometimes two, the liquid turning golden and rich, a layer of fat forming on top that she skimmed or stirred back in depending on the weather. Nutritionists dismissed bone broth as folk medicine. Then the wellness industry discovered it and started selling it for $12 a jar. Prolonged simmering extracts collagen from connective tissue, converting it into gelatin rich in glycine and proline, amino acids that support gut lining repair and joint health. The process draws calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus from the bones. She never bought a supplement. She just kept that pot going, and the broth she ladled into jars fed her family through every cold and every lean week when the groceries ran short. The crock sat cane syrup made by boiling sugarcane juice into a thick amber liquid was a staple sweetener in Black households across Louisiana, Georgia, and the Carolinas. It kept indefinitely. Unlike corn syrup, cane syrup retains trace minerals, iron, calcium, potassium, and the Southern Foodways Alliance has documented it as a cornerstone of African American cooking traditions. She poured it slow over hot biscuits, mixed it into pecan pie filling, and stirred it into coffee when the sugar bowl ran low. Black-owned cane mills once dotted rural roads from Baton Rouge to Savannah, pressing cane each fall while communities gathered to watch. When the mills went silent, the tins stopped coming, and the woman who could tell you which mill pressed the sweetest syrup was already gone by then. Long before gut health became a wellness trend, the canning shelf in her kitchen held rows of fermented chow chow that had been doing the same work for decades. Hot sauce integration techniques varied among Black grandmothers, each having preferred methods for adding heat without overwhelming other flavors. Some added Louisiana-style hot sauce directly to the buttermilk soak, letting vinegar and pepper infuse the meat over hours. Others mixed cayenne into seasoned flour, distributing heat evenly across the crust. A few brushed hot sauce onto finished pieces while still glistening from the fryer. The goal was layered heat that built gradually rather than assaulting the tongue. Children with sensitive palates got milder pieces, while adults enjoyed versions that made foreheads sweat. Regional preferences influenced choices. Some families favored vinegar-based sauces, while others preferred thicker pepper blends. This customization showed how basic technique adapted to different tastes. Keeping cast iron seasoned with lard after every use was treated as sacred duty in African American kitchens, where skillets passed down through generations. After washing with minimal soap and hot water, grandmothers dried cast iron completely over heat, then rubbed a thin layer of lard across every surface before storing. This process built up layers of polymerized fat that created a natural nonstick surface superior to modern chemical coatings. The seasoning protected iron from rust and improved heat distribution. Food scientists now explain that heated fats undergo polymerization, bonding to iron at the molecular level to create durable, slick cooking surface. A well-seasoned cast iron skillet was among the most valuable kitchen tools a family could own. Placing shoes in the freezer to eliminate odors was a technique African American households employed when commercial deodorizers were unavailable. Grandmothers would seal smelly sneakers in plastic bags and freeze them overnight, returning them odor-free by morning. Scientists now confirm that freezing kills bacteria responsible for foot odor, achieving results no spray could match. The extreme cold destroys bacterial cell walls, eliminating the source rather than masking it. This hack was particularly valuable in households with active children whose shoes took serious punishment. Women would clear freezer space on Sunday nights, treating the family's shoes for the week. The practice demonstrated resourceful thinking using existing appliances. Using molasses instead of white sugar was considered old-fashioned and unsophisticated, a mark of poverty rather than deliberate choice. Scientists now recognize that blackstrap molasses contains significant iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium that refined white sugar strips away during processing. Research confirms that molasses provides antioxidants supporting bone health, blood sugar regulation, and cardiovascular function. African American cooks stirred it into coffee, drizzled it over biscuits, and baked it into gingerbread that satisfied sweet cravings while delivering actual nutrition. Grandmothers kept sticky jars in pantries, using molasses when money was tight, unknowingly choosing the healthier option. What was dismissed as poverty cooking turns out to be nutritional wisdom modern health advocates now recommend. Number 15, fermenting cabbage and peppers into chow chow. Late September in Edgefield, South Carolina, the last of the green tomatoes pulled from the garden, shredded with cabbage and onion and hot peppers, salted heavy and pressed into a stoneware crock with a wooden weight on top. She covered the crock with a clean cloth and set it on the back porch for 9 days. The crock smelled like a thunderstorm. Wild lactic acid bacteria fermented the vegetables into a tangy, crunchy relish she would eat all winter, served alongside black-eyed peas and rice. Lactic acid fermented vegetables carry living probiotics. Lactobacillus strains the modern microbiome research links to better gut barrier function and lower inflammation in your body. She did not call it probiotic, she called it chow chow. By 2019, The National Institutes of Health was funding studies on fermented vegetables and gut health. Her crock was older than the grant by half a century. Number 16, red dye. Number 2, the colorant called amaranth. This was the red that made the red, the dye that gave the candy on the church table and the cake on the holiday sideboard their deep festive color. Before red velvet leaned on beet juice and modern dyes, red number 2 was the workhorse in the punch, the frosting, the penny candy children begged for. It was in everything, bright and sweet. Then the lab work came back grim. By 1969, the dye had been tied to a rising count of tumors in tested rats, and the worry only grew through the early 70s. The agency held out as long as it could, then gave way to the evidence. In 1976, the FDA banned red dye number 2 from the American food supply, scrubbing it out of the candy and the cakes where it had lived for generations. A color that had meant celebration on Black family tables was delisted by federal order, sent the way of every additive that could not survive a closer look. Number 15, cabbage stewed with neck bones. A butcher in Memphis in 1962 sold neck bones for 19 cents a pound, and most cooks bought them by the bag. A cook carried the bag home in brown paper, tipped it into a deep pot with green cabbage, an onion cut in half, and a spoonful of black pepper. The pot simmered 4 hours. The meat slid off the bone. The collagen melted into the broth and turned to a soft gel as the pot cooled overnight. The same compound that home cooks were pulling out of bones in 1962 is what every collagen powder company now sells in a tub for $40. The pot did the work. The lab took the credit later. She didn't build the children she fed. She just put another ladle on the plate and watched them clean it. Her broth was already what every wellness aisle is now trying to sell back to you. She didn't know to charge for it. Number 14, rendered tallow coating. Beef tallow, rendered slowly from suet until clear and golden, was poured over cheese wheels, sausage links, and dried meats to create a waxy seal that blocked air and moisture. The tallow hardened at room temperature into a firm barrier, like a coat of armor that kept food usable for months. A sausage link sealed in tallow could sit on a cellar shelf through an entire winter and come out tasting nearly the same as the day it was made. The seal was so complete that you had to crack it apart with your hands before you could slice the meat inside. Health departments called this outdated once refrigeration became affordable, but tallow coating works on the same principle as vacuum sealing. It creates an oxygen-free environment that prevents oxidation and stops aerobic bacteria from growing. You can still find artisan cheese makers in Vermont using wax coatings for the same reason. The difference is that they charge a premium for it. Your grandmother gave it away. But if the weeknight skillet held quiet rhythms of survival, the holiday table held something louder, and nothing announced a celebration like a ham glazed with Coca-Cola. Your mother scored the fat in diamond patterns, studded each cross with a whole clove, and poured an entire bottle of Coke over the top before the pan went in the oven. The phosphoric acid tenderized the outer layer, while the sugar caramelized into a glaze so dark and sticky it looked like lacquer. The kitchen smelled like Christmas for hours. This hack came from the collision of Southern cooking and American consumer culture, where a 5-cent soda became an ingredient no fancy product could outperform. At church dinners and reunions, the woman who brought the Coca-Cola ham never took home leftovers. Kids peeled strips of the sweet, salty crust off the edges before adults said grace. The recipe traveled by reputation, one mother telling another, never written down because nobody who tasted it could forget. And if muscadine wine was the secret the pantry kept, turtle soup was the secret the creek kept. Freshwater turtles, snappers, sliders, soft shells were a primary protein for Black households in the rural South, caught by hand in creeks that had fed communities for generations. The soup was dark, built from turtle meat, simmered with tomatoes, onions, celery, and hard-boiled eggs. The meat had a texture like no other, tender but firm, somewhere between chicken and something wilder. As conservation boards expanded, waterway regulations restricted harvesting, and licensing followed the same pattern as the hunting laws. Wildlife management on paper, control of black movement in practice. A man pulling a snapper from a creek on a white landowner's property faced trespassing and poaching charges both. The soup pots went cold. A dish that once anchored Saturday supper faded to memory. The crack of shell, the smell of broth, the weight of something wild becoming warm. The bottle sat right next to the stove, apple cider vinegar, cap already loose because she reached for it so often. A splash went into the greens, a pour went into the beans, a few drops finished the broth. It sharpened everything, cut through the pork fat, and gave the pot a brightness that balanced the smoke and salt. Nobody explained why, you just did it because she did it. Acetic acid increases the solubility of non-heme iron, the kind in plant foods, making it far easier for the body to absorb. That splash also lowers the pH of the cooking liquid, preserving heat-sensitive vitamins like C and thiamine that degrade during long simmering. Vinegar is also a natural antimicrobial that inhibits harmful bacteria in stored food. She was boosting mineral absorption, preserving vitamins, and extending food safety with one twist of a bottle cap, and she never once called it science. Chow chow, a tangy relish of green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and hot peppers, was preserved in vinegar brine and canned every fall across black households in the Carolinas, Virginia, and Tennessee. The fermentation produced natural probiotics, the same beneficial bacteria now sold as expensive supplements. Nobody called it probiotics then. They called it putting up food for winter. She spooned it over field. Peas, piled it on pinto beans, and set the jar on the table like it belonged at every meal. Each family's recipe differed. More pepper here, sweeter there, some with mustard seed, and the differences were argued about at church dinners with the same heat as scripture. The recipe was never written because writing it meant admitting someone else might need to make it someday. The bin sat in the corner like furniture, a square metal container with a tight lid, filled with stone ground cornmeal bought in bulk from the local mill. Bone broth, simmered for days, was a kitchen constant in African-American homes where pots of bones and herbs stayed on the back of the stove for hours. Neck bones, ham hocks, chicken backs, and oxtails were slow cooked until marrow dissolved into rich golden liquid that became the base for soups, gravies, and rice. Modern health trends have only recently caught up to what Black grandmothers always knew. Long simmered bone broth is rich in collagen, gelatin, and amino acids, supporting gut health and joint function. The practice of saving bones and simmering them was dismissed as thrifty desperation, but scientists confirm it extracts minerals in highly bioavailable forms. What wellness brands sell for premium prices was once free in every Black kitchen. Breakfast preparation efficiency meant one skillet could cook an entire morning meal in sequence without washing between items. Black mothers in the 1960s feeding families before work and school needed speed and simplicity. The cast iron skillet started with bacon, is rendered fat remaining in the pan to fry eggs, which were followed by potatoes crisped in the remaining grease. Nothing was wasted. Nothing required scrubbing between steps. The flavors built upon each other. Bacon-scented eggs, pork-flavored potatoes. Children ate plates assembled from this single-pan production while mothers worked efficiently at the stove. The skillet was wiped with a cloth between uses, never washed with soap that would strip seasoning. This system fed families quickly on busy mornings when time was precious. Adding a bay leaf to stored rice and flour was a natural pest prevention method African American cooks used long before chemical pesticides became common. Dried bay leaves were tucked into containers of rice, flour, cornmeal, and other dry goods, keeping weevils and pantry moths away without toxic substances. The strong aromatic compounds in bay leaves, particularly eucalyptol, repel insects naturally while leaving no taste in stored food. Grandmothers understood prevention was easier than dealing with infested supplies, and bay leaves were inexpensive. Modern entomologists confirm these aromatic compounds do deter common pantry pests. This technique protected precious food supplies in homes without modern sealed packaging. The hack represented practical wisdom about working with nature rather than against it. Using onion halves to absorb paint fumes was an African American household trick that painters now recommend. When fresh paint made rooms unbearable, grandmothers would cut onions in half and place them around the space, somehow neutralizing the harsh chemical smell within hours. Scientists have confirmed that onions contain sulfur compounds that bind with volatile organic compounds released by paint, effectively removing them from the air. The onions would turn dark as they absorb toxins, serving as visual proof of their effectiveness. This hack was particularly important in homes without air conditioning, where opening windows wasn't always practical during hot summers or cold winters. Women protected their families from harmful fumes using nothing but vegetables from their kitchens. Double frying for extra crispiness was considered wasteful by those who did not understand the science happening in that hot oil. African American cooks knew that frying chicken twice produced a crust that stayed crispy for hours, perfect for church picnics where food sat on tables through long afternoons. Scientists now confirm that the first fry cooks the interior and sets the coating, while the second fry at higher temperature creates a shatteringly crisp exterior with less oil absorption. The technique drives out moisture that would otherwise make coatings soggy. Grandmothers learned through trial what food engineers now study in laboratories. That extra step transformed ordinary fried chicken into legendary fried chicken. What seemed like unnecessary effort was precise technique that single frying simply cannot match. Number 14, slow cooking gumbo with okra as the thickener. A cast iron pot in a Creole kitchen in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, with a dark roux on the bottom, a quart of stock from the bones of 2 stewing hens, and a heap of fresh okra cut into rounds. The okra hit the hot stock and released its mucilage, the thick fluid that thickened the broth without flour. The mucilage in okra is soluble fiber, polysaccharides made of galactose and rhamnose. Soluble fiber slows glucose absorption, binds to bile acids, and lowers LDL cholesterol over time. The 1970s told her okra was country food and beneath the modern table. By 2021, dietitians were prescribing okra to diabetic patients for blood sugar control. Her gumbo had been doing the same job at every Sunday supper since 1944, when her aunt walked her through the roux. She still made it the same way. The roux took 45 minutes. You couldn't rush it. She wouldn't let her granddaughter touch the spoon until the girl could tell the color by the smell. When the okra hit the pot, the kitchen smelled green and bright. The broth went from thin to silk. In 3 minutes, she served it over rice cooked in chicken broth. The bowl in your hand was a full supper. 2 of her grandsons were in their 50s and on no diabetes medication. The youngest ran a restaurant in New Orleans and put the pot on the menu under his great aunt's name. She lived to see it. A list like this can read like a celebration. It isn't. These methods were carried by women paid a fraction of what their neighbors earned. They stood at a stove every night because no one else would. The part few people talk about is that the cooking wasn't a hobby. It was a math problem run twice a day. The methods worked because they had to. The fact that nutritionists are now recommending them isn't a vindication. It's the history catching up. Number 15, coat's foot. Like comfrey, this was a plant the old folks kept for the cough that would not quit. They brewed the leaves into a tea or boiled them down into a syrup, and they swore by it through every winter, a remedy carried over from the old country and kept alive in southern kitchens. The name itself promised healing for the chest, but coltsfoot belongs to the same toxic family as comfrey, loaded with the same pyrrolizidine alkaloids that quietly destroy the liver and have been linked to cancer. A tea taken for comfort was scarring an organ with every cup. The FDA flagged it among the dangerous botanicals and pushed it out of dietary supplements, warning the public against the very cure their grandmothers had trusted. A plant kept for generations to soothe a sick child turned out to carry a slow and hidden harm, restricted once the science named what it really did. 13, chitterlings slow-simmered, a kitchen in Charleston in 1968. A woman at the sink with both windows propped open and the back door wedged with a brick. Hog intestines in a basin of cold water and white vinegar, scrubbed by hand for 2 hours before the simmer even began. She turned each fold inside out, ran her thumb down the seam, rinsed, and stacked the clean strips on a wooden board. The smell filled the back porch. The neighbors knew what was for supper before they walked past the gate. After the cleaning came the pot: onion, celery, garlic, a bay leaf, water to cover, 4 hours low. By the time the pot came off the heat, the connective tissue had broken down into something soft and rich, and the kitchen had gone quiet, the work done. White nutritionists in the 1970s called the dish primitive. Modern food anthropologists like Michael Twitty call it one of the clearest examples of nose-to-tail cooking ever practiced in this country. The woman in Charleston cleaned chitterlings the same way her own mother had cleaned them in 1898. Nothing about the food changed, only the fashion around it did. Time after time, the fashion changed and the food was waiting on the other side, the same as it had always been. You can trace the entire history of American nutrition advice through one pot of chitterlings. The pot does not move. The advice keeps moving around it. The pot wins. Every dietary chart written between 1977 and 2010 was written by a committee of people who did not eat from this pot. They wrote about energy intake percentages and saturated fat ceilings. They did not write about the women in Charleston, in Macon, in Memphis, who had been cleaning intestines, simmering bones, fermenting vegetables, and feeding 9 people on $3 a week since before the federal government had a nutrition committee at all. The committees changed every few years. The cooks did not. 13, fermented hot sauce. Black families in Louisiana and the Carolina Low Country packed fresh peppers into jars with salt and let them sit on the shelf for weeks or months. The peppers bubbled, softened, and transformed into a tangy, complex hot sauce through lacto fermentation. No vinegar needed, no cooking required. The salt drew water from the peppers and created a brine where lactic acid bacteria thrived, while harmful organisms could not. The longer the sauce sat, the deeper the flavor became. A jar that started sharp and simple in September tasted rounded and complex by Thanksgiving, like wine aging in a barrel. Health codes eventually required commercially sold hot sauces to be heat processed, which killed the beneficial bacteria that made fermented sauce special. But research published in journals on food microbiology has confirmed that lacto-fermented foods contain probiotic strains that support digestive health. The hot sauce on your grandmother's table was alive with beneficial bacteria that a pasteurized bottle from the grocery store does not contain. She was feeding your family's gut microbiome before that phrase existed. The fried fish came out of the oil crackling and golden, and your mother laid each piece on a brown paper grocery bag spread flat across the counter. Never a plate, never a wire rack. The paper bag was the only thing she trusted because it pulled grease out of the crust without trapping steam underneath, keeping the coating crisp while the inside stayed tender and hot. Paper towels did not exist in most black kitchens until well into the 1970s, and even after they arrived, plenty of women refused to switch. The brown bag breathed. It absorbed without suffocating. You could hear the oil hissing faintly as it sank into the paper, and the bag darkened in circles beneath each piece like a map of the meal. Friday night fish fries ran on this system. Catfish and whiting dredged in seasoned cornmeal and lowered into cast iron Dutch ovens filled with shimmering grease. The bag was always there waiting. Your mother's hands moved fast, tongs in, one fist, and the kitchen was so loud with popping oil and gospel radio that you had to shout to be heard. Nobody fries fish on brown bags anymore. If speakeasy chicken belonged to the city, raccoon and sweet potato belonged to the country, and the country had its own laws to break. Raccoon had been survival food for black households across the rural South for generations. The meat soaked overnight in salt water, then braised low and slow with sweet potatoes, onions, and whatever pepper grew near the porch until the fat melted into the dish and everything turned golden and rich. The animal was hunted at night with dogs, the sound of their baying rolling across hollow and field. By the 1920s, game commissions required licenses for raccoon, and night hunting was banned outright in Georgia, the Carolinas, and most of the Deep South. A man caught without papers faced fines he could never pay or jail time that fed the convict lease system. The traps got smaller, the hunts went deeper, and a dish that once anchored cool weather suppers across the Black Belt became something people only whispered about making. In the corner, heavy, brown, with a chipped lid that never sealed right. Inside, peppers and cabbage sat in salt brine, bubbling slowly, smelling sharp and alive. Chow chow, pepper sauce, pickled watermelon rind. These were not recipes you looked up. They were things you watched someone make and then made yourself until the taste was close enough. Health inspectors would have shut it down. Extension agents warned against food sitting out. But lacto-fermentation creates an acidic environment where beneficial lactobacillus thrive and harmful pathogens die. Those bacteria produce probiotics that modern gastroenterology now links to improved digestion, immune strength, and mental health through the gut-brain axis. The women who packed those crocks every fall were building gut health with salt and patience, decades before anyone called it a microbiome. While those crocks fermented in the corner, something simpler was happening on the stove. Not the degerminated, bleached cornmeal on grocery shelves today, stripped of its germ, bran, B vitamins, and fiber. Whole ground cornmeal retained every part of the kernel, including nutrients that modern processing deliberately removes for shelf stability. Indigenous peoples taught nixtamalization, treating corn with alkaline ash water to unlock niacin and prevent pellagra, and Black families carried that knowledge through generations of cornbread, hoe cakes, and mush. The metal bin kept weevils out and moisture away, and she refilled it the moment it dropped below half. Cornmeal was the floor beneath the floor, the thing you reached for when everything else was gone. Hot water cornbread came together in 5 minutes if the bin was full, and her bin was always full. Her grandmother called it cooking grease. The 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans now call it a healthy added fat. Cooking with potash and lye was a practice African American families used for generations, particularly in preparing hominy and nixtamalized corn. Wood ash was soaked in water to create an alkaline solution that softened dried corn kernels and removed their tough outer hulls. Health officials condemned lye as dangerous, with no place in food preparation. But food scientists now recognize this as nixtamalization, a technique that dramatically increases the nutritional value of corn by releasing bound niacin and improving protein quality. Without this treatment, communities relying heavily on corn risked pellagra, a devastating deficiency disease. African American and indigenous families who processed corn with lye were preventing nutritional disease centuries before scientists understood the chemistry. Wrapping cake layers in cloth while still warm was a technique African American bakers used to achieve moist, tender cakes that stayed fresh for days. As soon as layers came from the oven, grandmothers turned them onto clean cotton towels, wrapping gently while still steaming. The cloth trapped moisture that would otherwise escape, keeping cake soft instead of letting it dry out as it cooled. This method also prevented the crusty exterior that forms when cakes cool uncovered. Modern baking science confirms that steam retention during cooling keeps crumb structure tender and prevents moisture loss, leading to stale texture. Professional bakers now use plastic wrap for similar effect, but cotton cloth worked just as well. This hack ensured even simple cakes tasted rich and fresh at church gatherings. Storing brown, placing rice in salt shakers to prevent clumping was universal knowledge in African American kitchens where humidity constantly threatened dry goods. Grandmothers would drop a few grains of uncooked rice into every salt container, keeping the crystals flowing freely through the wettest summers. Scientists confirmed that rice absorbs ambient moisture faster than salt, protecting surrounding crystals from humidity that would cause them to stick together. The rice grains were large enough to stay behind while salt poured through shaker holes. This hack cost virtually nothing and lasted indefinitely since rice rarely needed replacement. Women shared this wisdom at church potlucks and family gatherings where proper seasoning mattered. The technique exemplified how simple observations solved everyday problems elegantly. Number 14, beef brain and spinal cord. Nothing was wasted in the soul food tradition, and the head of the steer was no exception. Brain was scrambled with eggs for breakfast, soft and rich, a dish poor families across the South knew well. The spinal cord and the tender odd cuts went into stews and gravies. This was the deepest kind of thrift, the cooking born of having to use everything because the choice cuts went elsewhere, and it produced flavors that fancier kitchens never bothered to chase. Generations grew up on brains and eggs the way others grew up on bacon. Then came mad cow disease. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy turned out to spread through exactly these tissues, the brain and the spinal cord and the nervous system, where the infectious agent gathered thickest. A human form of the disease, fatal and untreatable, could pass to anyone who ate the wrong part of an infected animal. The danger was not a stomachache, it was a sponge slowly eating holes in the brain with no cure and no coming back. So the government drew its hardest line on the parts that had fed the poorest cooks the longest. In 2004, the USDA prohibited the use of specified risk materials in human food, banning the brain, the spinal cord, and the nervous tissue of older cattle from ever reaching a plate. brains, and eggs. A breakfast that had stretched a family's food for over a century was outlawed in a single rule. It is the cruelest kind of irony in this whole list. The very thrift that kept people alive, the refusal to waste a single part of the animal, became the exact thing the science said could kill you. A tradition built on dignity and survival was ended not because it was poor cooking, but because a disease had finally given the agencies no other choice. Number 12, open kettle canning. Your grandmother filled mason jars with boiling hot fruit, jelly, or tomatoes and sealed them immediately with a lid and ring. No water bath, no pressure canner, just the heat of the food itself creating a vacuum as the jar cooled. You heard the lid pop and click, and that sound meant the seal had taken. That pop was as satisfying as locking a door. The USDA declared open kettle canning unsafe in the 1980s because the temperature of the food drops too quickly to guarantee a sterile seal. And they had a point. For low-acid foods like green beans or meats, the risk of botulism was real and should not be dismissed. But for high-acid foods like tomatoes, fruits, and pickles, the combination of heat and acidity created conditions where Clostridium botulinum cannot grow. Millions of jars of preserves were put up this way across the Black South without incident. The method was not reckless, it was specific. Black women knew which foods could be kettle canned and which ones needed the pressure canner. They sorted that knowledge without a pH meter and passed it down at kitchen tables like an inheritance. Centuries before the Volstead Act, West African communities brewed beer from grain, millet, sorghum, corn, using open fermentation that turned simple ingredients into something alive. Enslaved Africans brought those traditions to the American South, and corn beer became a quiet staple in rural Black households. Cracked corn, water, a little molasses, left in a jug for days until it turned sour and fizzy, a low alcohol drink that tasted like the land itself. When Prohibition banned all beer production at home, even while allowing fruit wine, corn beer was criminalized overnight. A tradition with roots in the Yoruba and Akan peoples vanished from porches across the South. The old women who knew when the fermentation was ready, by the sound of the bubbles, the smell of the crock, stopped making it. Nobody learned to listen for those bubbles after they were gone. The argument was always the same. Who got the thigh? Not the breast. Nobody fought over the breast. The breast was dry, bland, and only good if you drowned it in gravy. The real eating was in the dark meat, the legs and thighs where the flavor lived, where the fat kept everything moist and the meat pulled clean from the bone. White America spent decades marketing the chicken breast as the healthy choice, lean, low fat, the protein of discipline. Meanwhile, dark meat contains more iron, more zinc, more riboflavin, more thiamine, more B6, and more B12 than white meat. The higher myoglobin content that gives it color is the same compound that delivers oxygen to muscle tissue, and more myoglobin means more nutrition. The preference for white meat was never science, it was marketing. The families who fought over drumsticks at Sunday dinner were eating the better cut every single time, and they knew it, not because a label told them, but because the taste told them first. Here are 100 banned African American cooking tricks that scientists now say were genius. 100 tricks that were called old-fashioned, unnecessary, even unsanitary, and every single one of them worked. The women who invented these methods never got a patent or a cookbook deal. They got a family that ate well on almost nothing. If your grandmother or your mother had a kitchen trick that nobody believed in, drop it in the comments. And if this is your first time here, subscribe so you never miss another one of these.